Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you think you know exactly what absolute betrayal and perfect calculated revenge look like, you need to firmly brace yourselves for this. Before we dive into this explosive journey of justice, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a like. You are about to witness exactly how an arrogant man violently loses absolutely everything he owns in a single sunrise. Let's dive into the bride's revenge. The bride's revenge. The slap that destroyed an empire. Can you possibly imagine the absolute happiest day of your entire life, violently transforming into a highly public, living nightmare right in front of your entire city? Victoria Kensington was flawlessly dressed in pristine white, eagerly waiting to begin her beautiful married life, when her wealthy groom did the absolute unthinkable. He brutally, violently assaulted her on the stone steps of the church, directly under the eyes of God and hundreds of elite guests. But if you arrogantly think this is a pathetic story about a weak victim who silently surrenders, you are completely, utterly wrong. Absolutely no one could have ever imagined that that single, violent strike would aggressively unleash a revenge so incredibly cold, calculating, and flawless that years later it would leave the entire nation completely breathless. Prepare yourselves, because you will absolutely never see this ending coming. The brutal midday sun beat down mercilessly on the historic cobblestone streets of Beaufort, South Carolina, making the massive stained glass dome of the ancient parish brilliantly shine with an intensity that physically hurt the eyes. The entire elite high society of the city had aggressively gathered in the main square, eagerly waiting to see the absolute most beautiful bride of the entire social season gracefully step out of her classic, vintage Rolls-Royce. The massive church bells rang loudly, joyfully announcing what absolutely everyone blindly believed was the flawless, perfect union between two of the wealthiest, most highly respected corporate families in the entire state. However, the suffocatingly hot, humid air brought with it an incredibly heavy, toxic sensation. Exactly as if the atmosphere itself profoundly knew that something was horribly, terribly wrong. Victoria Kensington sat nervously in the plush back seat of the luxury car, meticulously smoothing out the imported French lace skirt that her mother had lovingly, obsessively chosen for the 100th time. Her soft hands violently trembled over her massive bouquet of pristine white orchids, and although she desperately, bravely tried to smile at her proud father sitting right next to her, she physically felt a massive, painful knot aggressively tightening in her stomach that she literally could not untie. She frantically repeated to herself that it was just standard pre-wedding jitters, the massive anxiety of ensuring absolutely everything was flawless under the highly critical, judging eyes of local high society. Outside the massive church doors, the elite guests were rapidly losing their patience, aggressively fanning themselves with the expensive, gold-embossed ceremony programs to brutally combat the suffocating May heat. A low, buzzing murmur aggressively began to grow exactly like a massive swarm of angry bees, rapidly shifting from polite compliments about the luxury floral arrangements to highly uncomfortable, toxic whispers about the missing groom. Alexander Caldwell absolutely had not arrived at the highly scheduled time, and a late groom was exactly what the superstitious, wealthy grandmothers of the city universally considered an incredibly dark, terrifying omen of horrific bad luck. Mrs. Chilnoid's Eleanor Caldwell, Alexander's highly arrogant, terrifying mother, aggressively checked her $30,000 gold Rolex with a highly toxic mixture of blinding fury and deep concern, her sharp eyes frantically scanning the main avenue for her son's luxury SUV. She absolutely knew significantly better than anyone else, that Alexander had aggressively spent the entire previous night violently celebrating his bachelor party with way too much toxic intensity. She silently, desperately prayed to every single saint that her arrogant son would miraculously appear completely sober and highly presentable, desperately begging that he wouldn't publicly humiliate their massive family name in front of so many powerful, influential politicians and CEOs. Finally, the deafening, aggressive roar of a massive black luxury truck violently shattered the murmuring crowd, screeching to a highly abrupt, aggressive halt directly in front of the stone steps of the massive church. Alexander heavily stepped out of the vehicle, aggressively yanking at his bespoke suit jacket with a violent, highly uncoordinated movement that absolutely did not go unnoticed by the sharp-eyed men in the crowd. His eyes were completely bloodshot, heavily hidden behind dark, expensive designer sunglasses that he absolutely refused to remove until he was standing in the dark shadows of the church entrance. His stride was incredibly heavy, completely unsteady, and highly, terrifyingly aggressive. As he confidently shoved his way past the very first row of elite guests, an unmistakable, highly toxic scent violently floated into the heavy air. A sickeningly sweet, penetrating, absolute stench of aged, cheap bourbon, aggressively mixed with expensive designer cologne. His best man, a wealthy childhood friend who looked equally, severely hungover, attempted to playfully slap him on the back to enthusiastically cheer him up. But Alexander simply responded with a highly aggressive, dry, guttural grunt. He absolutely refused to greet a single person, not even his own anxious mother, and aggressively marched straight down the aisle toward the altar, looking exactly as if he were marching directly toward a horrific death sentence that he utterly despised. Victoria stepped gracefully out of the vintage car, the absolute microsecond she saw Alexander finally enter the church, feeling a massive, overwhelming wave of pure relief that finally allowed her to pull oxygen back into her burning lungs. Her proud father graciously offered his arm, and together, they flawlessly began the slow, beautiful ascent up the stone stairs as the traditional wedding march loudly began to play on the ancient pipe organ. The elite crowd instantly stood up. Hundreds of smartphone cameras were aggressively raised into the air, and for one brief, beautiful moment, the breathtaking, flawless beauty of the bride miraculously made everyone completely forget the groom's highly disrespectful tardiness. But as she finally reached the altar, Alexander absolutely did not even bother to turn around to watch her approach. He aggressively kept his bloodshot eyes fixed dead ahead on the massive wooden cross at the back of the church, his jaw violently, visibly clenching. When Victoria's father lovingly handed over his precious daughter's hand, Alexander aggressively snatched it with violent, unadulterated force. There was absolutely zero tenderness. His fingers felt incredibly clammy, completely wet, and freezing cold. She desperately looked deeply into his eyes, searching frantically for that beautiful, loving complicity they used to share. But he aggressively kept his gaze locked straight ahead, breathing incredibly heavily through his mouth like a cornered animal. The highly sacred ceremony agonizingly progressed in a thick, toxic, suffocating fog, where the priest's beautiful words seemed to violently ricochet off an invisible, impenetrable brick wall. Alexander aggressively, constantly wiped the thick, freezing sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief, looking increasingly, violently irritated by the sheer length of the traditional mass. Every single time the elderly priest beautifully spoke about patience, unconditional love, and mutual respect, the groom aggressively made tiny, highly disrespectful grimaces, acting exactly as if hearing such profound advice physically, violently annoyed him. The highly anticipated moment for the vows finally arrived. Victoria's beautiful voice rang out incredibly clear and deeply sweet, completely filled with a genuine, pure hope that actively moved several older women in the front rows to absolute tears. When it was finally Alexander's turn, his heavy words sounded incredibly slurred and violently rushed. He aggressively sped through them, exactly like a man desperately trying to finish a highly boring, pathetic, bureaucratic chore. He absolutely refused to look her in the eyes for even a single microsecond, while formally swearing to fiercely love and deeply respect her for the absolute rest of his life. The highly symbolic ring exchange was incredibly clumsy and violently rough. He aggressively struggled to slide the diamond band onto her delicate finger, ultimately losing his toxic patience and violently forcing it on. Victoria physically felt a sharp, agonizing stab of pain in her knuckle, but she absolutely didn't utter a single word, flawlessly maintaining that perfect rehearsed smile she had practiced in the mirror for months. In her desperate mind, she frantically justified absolutely everything, blindly convincing herself that Alexander was simply overwhelmed with corporate wedding stress, massive business pressure, or the suffocating, unbearable heat inside the ancient church. When the priest finally, joyfully declared them husband and wife, the romantic kiss Alexander aggressively gave her was significantly more of a violent, painful clash of teeth than a loving, tender gesture. He aggressively tore himself away from her the absolute microsecond it was over and immediately began marching down the aisle toward the exit, completely abandoning her at the altar. Victoria was violently forced to awkwardly speed walk just to pathetically catch up to him and desperately link her arm through his. The elite guests cheered loudly, aggressively throwing traditional white rice and expensive rose petals into the air, creating a beautiful festive rain that violently, horrifyingly, contrasted with the dark, furious, miserable expression on the groom's face. They stepped out onto the massive stone steps, where the blinding sunlight violently hit them again. The highly expensive, elite wedding photographer immediately stopped them for the absolute mandatory, highly orchestrated photo shoot against the beautiful facade of the historic church. Alexander loudly, aggressively scoffed, violently loosening his silk tie with pure desperation, his bloodshot eyes frantically searching the massive crowd for a catering waiter holding a tray of hard liquor. "Just a few more quick shots, please. This is the absolute best natural lighting of the entire day," the highly professional photographer insisted politely, desperately trying to properly direct the chaotic scene. "That is absolutely enough, isn't it?" Alexander aggressively snapped. His voice was incredibly thick and heavily slurred, intentionally loud enough so that his arrogant parents and his terrified in-laws standing nearby could perfectly hear him. "I am incredibly thirsty, and it is hot as absolute hell out here. Let's get to the damn reception already." Victoria's mother fanned herself frantically, deeply nervous and highly embarrassed by her new son-in-law's incredibly toxic, vulgar tone, but she cowardly chose to look the other way. The photographer, visibly highly uncomfortable, but desperately trying to remain professional, politely requested one absolute final shot. "Just one loving embrace, please, and a look of pure love directed right at your beautiful bride." Alexander aggressively threw his heavy arm around Victoria's delicate shoulders, but it was absolute dead weight. It felt significantly more like a suffocating, heavy burden than a loving, protective embrace. She could physically, sickeningly, smell the toxic alcohol aggressively radiating from his sweating pores, a highly rancid, disgusting mixture that completely turned her stomach for the very first time that day. Victoria, desperately wanting to magically save the highly public moment and possess at least one beautiful, loving memory of her wedding day, gently, lovingly leaned in close to her husband's ear. With absolutely all the pure sweetness she was physically capable of, desperately attempting to gently calm the terrifying beast she clearly felt violently awakening inside him, she softly whispered a highly innocent piece of advice. "My love, please, just smile a tiny bit more. The expensive photos will look absolutely beautiful if we just look incredibly happy," she whispered incredibly softly. Those simple, loving, highly innocent words acted exactly like a massive nuclear detonator inside Alexander's heavily intoxicated, violently aggressive mind. In that exact, terrifying microsecond, he violently ripped himself completely out of her embrace with a highly aggressive, brutal movement, violently twisting his entire body to face her head-on. His bloodshot eyes were completely, utterly unhinged, with pure, irrational, blinding fury. "Are you telling me what the hell to do?" He violently roared at the absolute top of his lungs. His massive, terrifying voice aggressively echoed off the ancient stone walls of the church, instantly, violently silencing the live string quartet. The entire, massive square completely froze in absolute terror. The joyful laughter of playing children violently died. The hundreds of elite guests who were happily congratulating each other, aggressively, snapped their heads toward the couple in pure, unadulterated shock. Victoria violently stumbled a step backward, completely terrified by the sudden horrific transformation of the exact man she had literally just married minutes ago. "No, Alexander. I was just simply saying that," she desperately tried to explain, her voice violently trembling, raising her soft hands in a desperate gesture of peace. "Do not ever tell me what to do, and do not damn well demand that I smile when I absolutely do not want to," Alexander violently shrieked, completely, utterly losing his mind, entirely abandoning any microscopic trace of basic human civility. The massive amount of toxic alcohol in his system and his highly volatile, narcissistic character violently collided in an absolute perfect storm directly in front of hundreds of elite witnesses. Absolutely no one moved. Absolutely no one intervened. Everyone was completely, utterly paralyzed by the blinding disbelief of actively watching a wealthy groom violently screaming at his beautiful bride directly on the steps of the church. And then, the exact, horrifying gesture occurred that would violently alter the lives of absolutely everyone in that city forever. The exact, explosive moment that would permanently split history entirely in two. Alexander aggressively raised his heavy right hand, his palm completely open, and with a massive, violent swing, entirely loaded with pure, unadulterated contempt, he unleashed a brutal, highly aggressive dry strike. Smack! The massive palm of his heavy hand violently impacted Victoria's left cheek with absolute, brutal, devastating force. The horrifying sound was incredibly sharp, exactly like the violent crack of a leather whip. It aggressively echoed with a highly macabre, terrifying resonance throughout the absolute dead silence of the packed square. The sheer violent force of the massive impact was so incredibly severe that Victoria's delicate, custom lace veil was violently ripped completely out of her elaborate hairstyle, slowly fluttering down onto the dirty cobblestone. Victoria violently lost her balance. Her expensive designer heels completely gave way, and she violently collapsed directly onto her bare knees on the hard, unforgiving stones, aggressively clutching her burning face with both hands. Violent, bright red mark of Alexander's massive fingers instantly, aggressively, began to violently swell on the pale, flawless skin of the bride, highly visible for absolutely everyone to clearly see. She did absolutely not scream. She simply remained frozen there on her knees, staring blankly down at the dirty stones, her brilliant mind completely, utterly incapable of processing the horrifying fact that the absolute love of her life had just brutally assaulted her, mere minutes after formally swearing eternal love before God. Alexander stood arrogantly towering directly over her. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his broad chest aggressively heaving up and down. He showed absolutely zero microscopic drops of immediate regret or remorse. He aggressively, challengingly glared around at the massive crowd, looking exactly as if he were violently daring anyone to aggressively question his absolute authority over his brand new property. Pure, unadulterated horror aggressively settled into the wide eyes of the elite attendees, a highly toxic mixture of blinding fear and immense second-hand shame that completely froze the blood in their veins. It was in that exact, sepulchral, terrifying silence that the absolute first, heavily muffled, agonizing sob violently escaped Victoria's lips. A completely broken, devastating sound that literally shattered the soul. And as she violently wept on the hard ground, her pristine, imported white dress getting heavily covered in gray dirt and dust, absolutely everyone profoundly knew that the massive celebration had violently ended before it even began. The beautiful fairy tale had violently mutated into a highly public, horrifying nightmare. And Victoria Kensington's absolute living hell was only just aggressively opening its massive doors. Interactive question. Have you ever witnessed someone's true toxic colors come out in public? What did you do? Let us know in the comments. The fallout and the coward's escape. The highly agonizing, lacerating scream from Victoria's mother violently shattered the terrifying trance, acting exactly like a massive starting gun for absolute, unadulterated chaos to violently erupt across the church square. The older, wealthy society women aggressively clamped their manicured hands over their mouths to desperately muffle their own terrified screams, violently yanking their young children backward to hide their innocent faces in their expensive skirts, to prevent them from witnessing any more horrific violence. The elite guests, who mere seconds ago had been joyfully celebrating, violently surged backward in a massive, chaotic wave of pure panic, literally tripping over each other in a highly desperate attempt to physically distance themselves from the groom, who now seemed to aggressively radiate a dark, incredibly dangerous, lethal energy. Absolutely no one could believe that the highly anticipated wedding of the year had violently mutated into an active, horrific crime scene in a matter of seconds. Alexander absolutely did not move a single inch to help his sobbing wife. He didn't even bother to cast his arrogant eyes downward to observe the massive physical damage he had brutally inflicted on her beautiful face, which was already aggressively, visibly swelling. Instead, he began aggressively pacing in tight, erratic circles, exactly like a rabid, caged animal, violently running his hands through his expensive hair with an extreme, unhinged frustration that terrified absolutely everyone. "This is exactly what the hell happens when you constantly try to aggressively control me," he violently roared, his voice incredibly hoarse, aggressively pointing a highly accusatory finger directly at the weeping woman on the ground. To him, in his highly twisted, alcohol-fueled, narcissistic logic, she was entirely to blame for maliciously provoking him with her innocent, sweet whisper. Victoria's father, a highly respected, incredibly peaceful, wealthy Southern gentleman, violently snapped out of his initial paralyzing stupor. His face was completely contorted with pure, blinding, murderous fury, and his fists were aggressively clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He violently lunged directly toward Alexander, fully intending to aggressively defend his precious daughter's honor. But two of his own brothers aggressively tackled him, violently restraining him by the arms, absolutely terrified that a massive physical brawl would only aggressively worsen the catastrophic tragedy. "Let me go! I am going to violently kill that bastard!" the older man roared at the top of his lungs, the thick veins aggressively bulging on his neck, while his arrogant new son-in-law simply glared back at him with a highly cynical, highly provocative, toxic smirk. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, Alexander's arrogant mother, was as pale as a sheet of white paper. She was violently trembling from head to toe as she frantically looked back and forth between her unhinged son and the massive crowd that was currently aggressively judging him with pure disgust. She desperately attempted to cautiously approach him to calm him down, softly, pleadingly whispering his name. But Alexander aggressively, violently, swatted her hand away exactly as if her touch physically burned his skin. He glared at his own mother with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Do absolutely not touch me either, mother. Absolutely all women are the exact same. Manipulative, controlling parasites," he violently spat, leaving his arrogant mother completely speechless and her cold heart entirely broken. Victoria, still collapsed on the hard cobblestone, physically felt a massive, deafening ringing in her ears that completely drowned out the violent screams and the massive chaos aggressively surrounding her in that bitter moment. She slowly, agonizingly, brought her trembling hand to her mouth and tasted a highly metallic, warm flavor, horrifyingly realizing that the brutal force of the blow had violently smashed the inside of her lip directly against her teeth. She literally could not lift her head. The massive, crushing shame weighed infinitely heavier than the physical, burning pain. She physically felt the highly judging eyes of the entire city violently piercing her back exactly like burning red-hot needles. Her beautiful bridesmaids, dressed in expensive pastel gowns, finally violently snapped out of their shock and aggressively sprinted toward her. They rapidly formed a massive, highly protective human wall entirely around her to aggressively shield her from the highly toxic, morbid gaze of the curious crowd and her terrifying abuser. They aggressively dropped to their knees in the filthy dirt, literally not caring a single bit about ruining their $1,000 dresses, fiercely hugging their deeply traumatized friend, who was violently shaking exactly like a fragile leaf in the middle of a massive hurricane. "It's over, honey. It's completely over. Do absolutely not look at him," they desperately whispered into her ear, even though they profoundly knew that this highly compassionate white lie could absolutely not erase the horrific reality of what had just violently occurred. Father Thomas, an incredibly respected elderly priest who had personally baptized the vast majority of the elite guests present, aggressively marched down the stone steps of the altar with a highly urgent, furious stride, his heavy robes billowing in the wind. His wrinkled face heavily reflected pure as righteous, holy indignation. Absolutely never, in his entire 40 years of devoted priesthood, had he ever witnessed such a massive, horrific desecration directly on the sacred steps of the house of God. He had aggressively planted himself firmly directly in front of Alexander, raising a highly authoritative hand to strictly demand that he immediately stop and show a microscopic ounce of respect. "Son, have the absolute fear of God. What on earth do you think you are doing?" the elderly priest exclaimed, with a massively powerful voice, aggressively utilizing his ultimate moral authority to violently halt the young man's unhinged madness. Alexander abruptly stopped, and slowly, arrogantly looked the elderly priest up and down with an absolute, total lack of basic reverence. He let out a highly toxic, mocking laugh that literally froze the blood of the most devout guests. His basic respect for the church, for his elders, and for basic human decency seemed to have completely evaporated from his body right alongside his sobriety. Do absolutely not get involved in this, old man. This is a highly private matter strictly between my wife and me." Alexander violently fired back, aggressively, highly threateningly invading the elderly priest's personal space. "She maliciously tried to publicly humiliate me by dictating exactly how I should behave, and I am absolutely no one's pathetic puppet. Do you hear me?" He continued to violently scream, literal saliva flying from his mouth as he spoke. The massive crowd violently held its breath, completely terrified that the unhinged groom might actually physically assault the holy representative of the church. Father Thomas absolutely did not take a single step backward. He fiercely maintained his unyielding gaze directly into the young man's glassy, bloodshot eyes, desperately trying to find a single, microscopic trace of the innocent boy he had known decades ago. But before the priest could utter another powerful word, Alexander completely, violently, lost whatever microscopic ounce of toxic patience he had left. He aggressively raised both hands and violently shoved the elderly priest squarely in the chest. The fragile old man violently stumbled backward, completely losing his balance, and had to be aggressively caught by two terrified altar boys to prevent him from violently tumbling down the hard stone stairs. A massive, collective, deafening scream of pure horror violently erupted from the square. Physically assaulting an elderly priest was an absolute, unforgivable boundary that absolutely no one in that highly traditional, conservative town ever imagined anyone would ever cross. That highly violent gesture permanently, completely severed any microscopic thread of empathy that absolutely anyone might have still possessed for the wealthy groom. He was now an absolute, permanent pariah in the eyes of the entire city. Alexander was left standing completely alone in the absolute dead center of the church square, heavily surrounded by a massive, empty circle of space, while absolutely everyone glared at him exactly as if he were the literal, physical incarnation of the devil himself. Aggressively seizing the massive distraction of the assault on the priest, Victoria's oldest brother and two massive cousins quickly scooped up the traumatized bride, violently lifting her almost completely off her feet. Her legs were completely useless, and her pristine white dress was heavily stained with thick gray dirt on the knees and the hem. A highly tragic, heartbreaking image of absolute defeat. "Let's get inside right now, Victoria. You absolutely do not have to listen to this feral animal," her brother stated, his voice violently cracking with barely contained murderous rage. They aggressively carried her directly back inside the massive church, desperately seeking the safe, cool shadows of the ancient sanctuary, far away from the cruel, blinding sunlight and the highly toxic public gaze. They violently slammed the massive, heavy carved wooden doors shut with a deafening thud, permanently locking out Alexander's unhinged screams and the massive murmur of the terrified crowd. Inside, the silence was absolutely sepulchral, only violently broken by the highly uncontrollable, agonizing sobs of the shattered bride, which heavily echoed against the towering stone vaults. Outside, Alexander violently reacted the absolute second he realized they were actively taking his victim away. He aggressively sprinted directly toward the heavy locked doors, violently pounding on the thick wood with his clenched fists. "Open the damn door, Victoria! Do not cowardly hide from me! We are absolutely not finished talking!" He violently roared, completely, utterly oblivious to the highly grotesque, terrifying public spectacle he was actively putting on. His own wealthy groomsmen, deeply embarrassed and completely horrified, nervously looked at each other, totally unsure whether they should physically intervene or simply let him completely drown alone in his own toxic misery. Modern technology, incredibly cruel and lightning fast, violently kicked into action. Dozens of high-definition smartphones were aggressively raised high above the crowd, exactly like silent digital witnesses. From multiple flawless angles, the elite guests and curious bystanders passing by the square aggressively recorded every single toxic insult, every violent strike on the heavy door, and every single unhinged gesture from the out-of-control groom. Absolutely no one physically intervened, but absolutely everyone meticulously documented the massive, highly public social downfall of one of the absolute wealthiest, most powerful families in the entire state. The high-res videos aggressively began to violently circulate in private group chats across the city, before Alexander had even stopped violently pounding on the church door. "Look exactly what the hell just happened at the Caldwell wedding," the frantic messages read, heavily accompanied by highly explicit, high-definition clips of the exact brutal moment of the slap. The horrifying news flew significantly faster than the wind, violently jumping from phone to phone, aggressively crossing county lines in a matter of mere minutes. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, horrifyingly realizing that her arrogant son was being actively recorded, and that her massive, pristine social reputation was violently collapsing on live broadcast, desperately, frantically, tried to physically cover the phone cameras with her manicured hands. "Stop recording immediately! Respect the absolute privacy of this elite family!" she aggressively shrieked. But it was completely, utterly useless to try to stop the internet. Alexander, noticing the dozens of glowing phones pointed directly at him, far from cowardly hiding, actually seemed to aggressively embolden himself, exactly as if he were performing for a massive, invisible, morbid audience. He violently spun toward one of the cameras and roared, "Record absolutely everything you want, so you can finally learn exactly how to respect a real man." His highly toxic, arrogant words were permanently recorded for absolute posterity, flawlessly socially condemning him with irrefutable, undeniable federal evidence of his highly violent, unhinged character. Inside the dark church, Victoria was sitting heavily on a hard wooden pew, violently trembling, while her sobbing mother gently cleaned her burning face with a damp tissue. Her left cheek was incredibly bright red and burning hot to the touch, and her eye was rapidly beginning to swell shut from the brutal, massive impact. "Why, Mom? Why on earth did he do this to me?" she agonizingly asked between violent tears, completely incapable of intellectually processing how the absolute happiest day of her life had violently mutated into a horrific tragedy. Victoria's wealthy father, aggressively pacing back and forth down the center aisle, was furiously screaming on his phone with the local chief of police, aggressively demanding they immediately dispatch officers to violently drag the abuser off the property. "I literally do not give a damn who his wealthy father is. I want him violently removed in handcuffs right this exact second, or I will personally take care of him myself," he roared with a highly terrifying, lethal voice. The bride's powerful family instantly closed ranks, fiercely swearing to permanently protect her, even though they profoundly knew that the massive emotional damage would be infinitely harder to ever heal than the physical blow. Outside, the massive square rapidly began to completely empty out of the decent, elite guests who, completely horrified, highly preferred to flee to the safety of their mansions rather than continue witnessing the disgusting humiliation. The highly paid catering staff at the luxury reception hall, who were fully prepared to serve 300 elite guests, aggressively began receiving frantic phone calls, completely canceling the massive banquet and the live orchestra. The incredibly expensive gourmet food, the $20,000 floral arrangements, and the massive 5-tier luxury cake would remain completely untouched. Silent, pathetic witnesses to a massive celebration that absolutely never occurred. The primary viral video, boldly titled, "Arrogant Groom Brutally Assaults Bride Outside Church," aggressively began to amass hundreds of thousands of views on social media in less than a single hour. Thousands of angry comments from complete strangers aggressively piled up, completely filled with pure, unadulterated hatred toward Alexander, and profound, deep pity for the poor, beautiful girl in the horrific video. The massive public trial had officially begun, and the absolute verdict was entirely unanimous. Alexander was officially the absolute most hated villain in the entire country. Finally, hearing the loud, approaching wail of police sirens, Alexander's wealthy friends successfully managed to aggressively convince him that he desperately needed to flee the scene before he was violently arrested right there on the steps. Highly reluctantly, and still violently screaming toxic curses into the air, he aggressively climbed into the massive black luxury truck he had arrived in, violently screeching his expensive tires as he sped away. He left behind a massive cloud of thick smoke and a highly heavy, suffocating silence, completely loaded with terrifying tension and massive, unanswered questions about the future. Victoria remained safely hidden inside the dark church until night completely fell, utterly incapable of physically facing the outside world and the pathetic, pitying looks she absolutely knew were waiting for her. She slowly, painfully, took off the heavy diamond wedding band, which she had worn for less than one agonizing hour, and left it sitting completely alone on the dark wooden pew. It gleamed silently in the dark. That tiny, incredibly expensive circle of gold now perfectly represented a highly toxic, heavy chain from which she had violently freed herself in the absolute most painful way possible. Interactive question. He shoved the priest and yelled at the cameras. "Do you think Alexander's ego will be his ultimate downfall? Tell us what you think." The exile and the ashes of the bouquet. The horrifying news spread exactly like a violent wildfire across the entire nation, aggressively jumping from glowing smartphone screens directly to the primetime headlines of major national television networks. The wedding monster, or the assaulted bride, were the massive, bold phrases that aggressively headlined the explosive reports, heavily accompanied by the blurry but utterly undeniable video footage of the exact moment of the brutal assault. Beaufort, a highly peaceful, wealthy city traditionally known for its stunning colonial architecture and high society galas, violently transformed overnight into the absolute epicenter of a massive national debate on domestic violence. Aggressive national journalists arrived in massive news vans with heavy microphones, actively camping outside the church and the sprawling mansions of both prominent families, absolutely starving for an explosive exclusive. Alexander, the highly toxic protagonist of this incredibly shameful drama, had completely vanished exactly as if the earth had violently swallowed him whole the absolute second he sped out of the square. Absolutely no one knew where the hell he was. His massive luxury truck was later found completely abandoned on the dark outskirts of the city, right near the Federal Interstate Highway, with the keys still in the ignition and the heavy door thrown wide open. His wealthy family instantly, aggressively, went into total lockdown, violently lowering the heavy shutters of their massive mansion and permanently disconnecting all landline phones to desperately avoid the constant, highly aggressive harassment from the press and morbid onlookers. Massive rumors aggressively circulated in the elite country clubs that they had secretly shipped him off to Europe or to a highly remote, isolated ranch out west to cowardly hide him until the massive, toxic dust finally settled. Victoria, for her part, literally could not tolerate spending a single extra second in her parents' massive estate, where she physically felt the expensive walls violently suffocating her with painful memories and pathetic looks of pity. Every single time the doorbell rang, her heart violently accelerated, terrifyingly thinking it was him, aggressively returning to violently finish exactly what he had started, or to pathetically beg for a forgiveness she absolutely did not want to hear. She desperately needed to escape, not just from the noisy city, but from the highly compassionate, pitying gaze of the wealthy people who had watched her grow up and who now tragically viewed her as a completely shattered victim. She aggressively packed a small, cheap duffel bag with her oldest, most comfortable clothes and desperately begged her father to drive her incredibly far away. Far, far away from the massive noise and the crushing shame. The chosen destination was her maternal grandmother's ancient, highly isolated cabin, securely located at the absolute highest, most remote peak of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where cell phone service and internet connection were practically non-existent. The long, winding drive was incredibly silent. Her powerful father aggressively gripped the steering wheel with bone-white knuckles, desperately fighting back the massive urge to violently sob or aggressively scream out of pure, agonizing impotence for completely failing to protect his precious little girl. Upon finally arriving, the freezing, crisp mountain air and the highly comforting smell of burning firewood warmly welcomed her, exactly like an ancient, familiar embrace that fiercely promised her a highly secure, temporary sanctuary. Her grandmother, Beatrice, was calmly waiting at the heavy wooden gate, tightly wrapped in a thick gray shawl, possessing the fierce, unshakable gaze of a powerful woman who has personally survived dozens of violent hurricanes and profoundly knows that they all eventually pass. Grandma Beatrice absolutely did not ask stupid, probing questions, nor did she offer pathetic, empty consolations. Seeing her beautiful granddaughter slowly step out of the car with a heavily bruised face and her soul completely crushed, she simply threw her arms wide open and safely allowed Victoria to completely, violently collapse against her chest, loudly sobbing out absolutely all the agonizing tears she hadn't been able to cry in front of the greedy cameras. She gently led her to the small back bedroom, the exact same room Victoria used to sleep in as a happy child during summer vacations, where the simple bed featured hand-woven quilt and smelled beautifully of dried lavender. There, securely trapped between those 4 thick wooden walls, began the absolute, true agony of total isolation. The deafening, absolute silence that violently follows the explosive roar of a massive scandal. The very first few agonizing days were a thick, suffocating gray fog, where time physically seemed to have completely, permanently stopped. There were absolutely no schedules and 0 routines, only crushing darkness and blinding pain. Victoria violently refused to get out of the bed, agonizingly spending hours blankly staring up at the heavy wooden ceiling beams, obsessively replaying the horrific scene in her traumatized mind over and over again. She desperately, toxically asked herself exactly what she had done wrong, if her tone of voice had been slightly incorrect, if she should have just kept her damn mouth shut, violently falling into the highly toxic psychological trap of victim blaming. Alexander's terrifying, booming voice aggressively screaming at her violently echoed in her ears, significantly louder than the freezing wind howling outside, actively tormenting her even in her darkest nightmares. Her expensive smartphone, which had once been her vital connection to the elite world, lay completely powered off, buried deep in the absolute bottom of a wooden dresser drawer, exactly like a highly dangerous explosive artifact she was terrified to touch. She knew with absolute certainty that if she turned it on, She would be violently assaulted by thousands of unread messages, some offering pathetic support, others offering toxic mockery, and endless links to the viral video that would aggressively repeat her ultimate humiliation for all eternity. She highly preferred total, blissful ignorance. The absolute information vacuum of the isolated mountains, where the only news was exactly what the local milkman brought, or what the few mountain neighbors gossiped about when they hiked up to buy fresh cheese. She violently disconnected from her own entire life, completely transforming into a pathetic ghost, aimlessly wandering the dark hallways of the cabin in a faded nightgown. The massive, violent mark on her left cheek aggressively began to change color, transitioning from a highly intense, burning red to a deep, agonizing purple, and finally to a sickly, greenish yellow that gave her a highly unwell, tragic appearance. She aggressively avoided the mirrors at absolutely all costs. She violently draped a heavy bedsheet completely over the mirror in her room, because she literally could not bear to look at the pathetic reflection of the assaulted woman staring blankly back at her. She physically felt that the massive, ugly bruise wasn't just on her skin, but that it had permanently, violently tattooed her entire identity. She was now officially the battered bride, and she felt she would absolutely never be the powerful Victoria Kensington ever again. She felt incredibly dirty, permanently stained by the highly public violence, exactly as if she had violently lost a fundamental dignity she could absolutely never, ever recover. On the small, rustic coffee table in the living room, completely forgotten, lay the massive, incredibly expensive bridal bouquet she had been tightly gripping when she first arrived. A stunning $2,000 arrangement of pristine white roses and rare orchids. As the agonizing days passed, the beautiful flowers aggressively began to wither and die. The crisp white petals turned a highly depressing, crunchy brown, silently falling one by one onto the embroidered tablecloth. Victoria would sit heavily in the old armchair, blankly staring at them for hours on end, vividly seeing in that dying, pathetic bouquet the absolute perfect tragic metaphor for her ruined marriage and her completely shattered self-esteem. Absolutely no one dared to throw the expensive flowers into the trash. They remained sitting there, exactly like a depressing funeral monument to her violently shattered illusions. Grandma Beatrice quietly entered the room with steaming bowls of homemade chicken soup and hot herbal tea, aggressively forcing her broken granddaughter to eat at least a few spoonfuls so she wouldn't become physically ill. The physical body heals incredibly fast, my beautiful girl. It is the deep soul that painfully takes time. But the soul absolutely has a cure too, if we fiercely choose to heal it, the older woman would tell her with a highly raspy but incredibly loving voice. The wise old woman absolutely didn't pressure her to speak. She simply sat quietly, continuously knitting right beside her, graciously offering her silent, unbreakable company, exactly like a heavy iron anchor in the middle of a massive, emotional hurricane. She profoundly knew that empty words were completely useless when the blinding pain was so incredibly massive that it consumed the entire physical space of the cabin. Down below, in the wealthy city, elite life slowly continued its usual, arrogant rhythm. But the absolute main topic of conversation at every single country club corner remained the catastrophic, failed wedding and the mysterious whereabouts of the violent groom. High society violently divided. While the vast majority heavily supported Victoria, there was absolutely no shortage of highly toxic, misogynistic voices maliciously whispering that she must have actively done something terrible to provoke him into snapping like that. This highly toxic, disgusting social hypocrisy constantly reached the ears of Victoria's powerful father, who had to violently restrain himself multiple times from physically assaulting his former, wealthy friends right in the middle of the elite country club bar. The massive shame aggressively spread exactly like a thick oil spill, violently affecting absolutely everyone who carried the elite last names of both prominent families. Alexander's arrogant mother, Eleanor, desperately attempted to call the cabin's landline on several occasions, highly desperately seeking to, according to her, mediate the messy situation and check on her dear daughter-in-law. Grandma Beatrice, possessing the unbreakable firmness of an ancient oak tree, aggressively answered the landline and violently forbade the arrogant billionaire from ever calling again, explicitly telling her that her monster of a son had absolutely zero forgiveness from either God or man. Do absolutely not dare to ever bother her again, ma'am. Go fiercely occupy yourself with the absolute, horrific disgrace of a son you pathetically raised, and leave us the hell alone, Beatrice violently sentenced before slamming the heavy phone down so hard it almost broke. It was the absolute first time anyone had aggressively put the untouchable matriarch of the elite rich in her proper place, fiercely defending Victoria exactly like a highly protective lioness. The freezing nights in the mountains were agonizingly long and incredibly dark, entirely filled with the terrifying sounds of nocturnal animals and the loud, aggressive creaking of the ancient wood that violently startled Victoria in her highly vulnerable state. She would wake up violently screaming, completely drenched in freezing, cold sweat, instinctively, aggressively, throwing her hands up to violently protect her face from a massive, imaginary blow that absolutely was no longer there. The horrific trauma had aggressively hardwired itself directly into her physical reflexes, completely transforming her into a highly terrified, broken creature who jumped at her own shadow and violently flinched at loud noises. She would violently sob in absolute silence to avoid waking her grandmother, aggressively biting down hard on her pillow to completely muffle the agonizing sobs of absolute total despair. Exactly 2 Wajinsingo weeks violently passed, and the expensive bouquet of flowers on the table was now a completely dry, pathetic, skeletal remain. But Victoria still lacked the microscopic ounce of strength required to physically throw it away or even step out into the garden. She felt exactly like a helpless prisoner trapped inside her own body, violently stuck in a highly toxic cycle of deep depression that completely robbed her of the basic desire to shower or even brush her hair. Her hair, previously incredibly shiny and flawlessly maintained, was now entirely dull and heavily matted, a perfect physical external reflection of the massive, violent chaos reigning in her utterly shattered interior. She blankly stared down at her soft hands and completely failed to recognize the exact fingers that had briefly worn the heavy diamond ring. She felt exactly as if they belonged to a completely different person, to a naive, foolish woman who absolutely no longer existed. One crisp morning, her grandmother aggressively marched into the dark bedroom and violently yanked the heavy curtains completely open, allowing the harsh, blinding morning light to aggressively flood the room and violently assault Victoria's sensitive eyes. "That is absolutely enough of this pathetic morning, my girl. Crying your eyes out for a living piece of garbage who absolutely isn't worth a single damn thing is a massive, pathetic waste of your precious tears," Beatrice stated with absolute terrifying authority, aggressively pulling clean clothes completely out of the antique wardrobe. "Today, you are going to aggressively get out of that bed, you are going to take a scalding shower, and you are going to fiercely help me shuck the corn. because brutal physical hard work cures deep sorrow significantly better than hiding in a damn bed. Victoria weakly attempted to protest, but her grandmother's fierce, unbreakable glare absolutely admitted zero argument. So, she slowly dragged herself up, heavily shuffling her feet. Stepping out into the bright, open courtyard was a massive, violent shock of pure reality. The blinding sun, the freezing wind, and the loud, chaotic chirping of the birds violently contrasted with the dark, silent tomb she had been actively living in. She sat heavily on a wooden bench directly under the massive walnut tree and aggressively began to work with the rough ears of corn, physically feeling the highly abrasive, rough texture against her delicate, soft hands. The highly repetitive, strictly mechanical movement of her fingers generously provided a tiny, desperately needed breathing room for her chaotic mind. A brief pause in the violent, swirling hurricane of agonizing thoughts. For the absolute first time in agonizing days, she successfully managed to not actively think about Alexander for exactly 5 consecutive minutes, and that was a massive, tiny, invisible victory. However, the fragile peace was incredibly short-lived. That exact same afternoon, a highly arrogant, slick corporate lawyer from the city arrived in a massive, ultra-luxury sedan that completely, ridiculously clashed with the dirt and rocks of the mountain road. He aggressively came acting as the official legal representative of Alexander. He brought a massive stack of highly official legal documents and a disgustingly large multi-million-dollar financial offer to quietly repair the emotional damages and legally prevent a massive, public criminal lawsuit. Victoria's powerful father, who had briefly driven up the mountain to check on her, aggressively chased the arrogant lawyer completely off the property, violently screaming at the top of his lungs, aggressively threatening to unleash the massive guard dogs if he didn't violently speed away immediately. Victoria quietly heard absolutely everything from the open window. She began violently trembling with pure, unadulterated rage upon horrifyingly realizing that Alexander arrogantly, genuinely believed her absolute dignity actually had a cheap monetary price tag. That massive, highly offensive incident aggressively ignited an entirely different, incredibly violent spark deep inside her shattered soul. It was absolutely no longer just pathetic sadness or blinding fear. She now aggressively began to feel a completely different, boiling hot sensation in her chest. Pure, unadulterated, righteous indignation. How dare he arrogantly attempt to illegally buy her permanent silence after violently, publicly humiliating her in front of the entire world and actively destroying her entire life? She slowly turned and glared at the dead, dry bouquet sitting on the living room table with completely brand new eyes, no longer with pathetic pity, but seeing it exactly for what it truly, disgustingly represented. Those dead, pathetic flowers were the absolute, physical symbol of her weak submission, of her pathetic, passive waiting. And suddenly, they seemed incredibly, violently offensive. She marched aggressively toward the wooden table with a highly decisive, fierce stride. She violently grabbed the dry floral arrangement with both hands, physically feeling the highly brittle, dead leaves instantly crumble and shatter at her aggressive touch, falling uselessly to the floor. She confidently walked directly over to the stone fireplace, where a few thick logs were currently brightly burning, and entirely without a single second of hesitation, she violently hurled the entire, expensive bouquet directly into the roaring fire. The bright orange flames aggressively licked the dry flowers, violently consuming them in mere seconds, with a loud, rapid, incredibly satisfying crackle, instantly converting the $2,000 memory of her toxic marriage into nothing but gray, pathetic ash and thick, black smoke. She stood completely still, staring fiercely into the roaring fire, profoundly feeling that something highly toxic and weak deep inside her had also violently burned away, aggressively making massive room for something entirely brand new and completely unbreakable. Grandma Beatrice quietly watched her from the wooden doorframe, slowly, approvingly nodding her head. She profoundly knew that this was the absolute, true first step toward the fierce recovery of her powerful granddaughter. The violent fire actively purifies, Victoria. Let absolutely all the toxic garbage burn to the ground so that the truly powerful can finally, fiercely be born, the wise old woman murmured, quietly returning to her chores in the kitchen. Victoria absolutely did not reply. She remained completely, fiercely hypnotized by the violent flames, physically feeling the intense heat completely dry the pathetic tears that still stained her cheeks. But the brutal path to absolute recovery would absolutely not be a simple, straight line. That exact night, she violently dreamed about the horrific slap again, and she aggressively woke up screaming, brutally reminding her that the dark path would be incredibly long and highly torturous. The massive difference this time was that upon violently waking up, instead of pathetically curling up into a weak fetal position and sobbing, she aggressively sat straight up in the bed. She violently flicked on the bedside lamp. She aggressively grabbed a cheap old notebook and a sharp pencil, and she violently began to write down absolutely everything she intensely felt. She aggressively emptied every single drop of toxic venom from her traumatized mind directly onto the cheap paper. She wrote with such blinding, pure fury that she physically tore right through the paper multiple times with the sharp tip of the pencil, aggressively letting out the massive, suffocating hatred she had been desperately repressing. Agonizing days rapidly transformed into weeks, and the absolute isolation in the mountains completely ceased to be a pathetic escape, violently converting into a highly necessary, strategic retreat to aggressively rebuild her shattered soul, piece by broken piece. Victoria began aggressively eating significantly better. She quickly regained the healthy, vibrant color in her cheeks, and she fiercely helped her grandmother with the heavy, physical labor of tending to the animals and the massive vegetable garden. However, her beautiful gaze had completely, permanently changed. It absolutely no longer possessed the naive, innocent sparkle of a foolish, deluded bride. Now, her eyes were incredibly dark, deeply profound, bottomless wells, entirely filled with fierce, absolute distrust. The sweet, innocent girl from Beaufort had violently died on the steps of that church, and the fierce, terrifying woman who now actively inhabited her powerful body was a complete, unrecognizable stranger, even to herself. The elite people of the city completely stopped seeing her, and with her total absence, the highly toxic gossip slowly began to naturally diminish, rapidly replaced by brand new, fresh local scandals and corporate news. Alexander was still officially a massive fugitive with an active, unexecuted arrest warrant, quickly becoming an urban legend of toxic, wealthy impunity. Victoria profoundly knew that the elite world was slowly forgetting her. She knew they arrogantly expected her to cower and remain permanently hidden away, exactly like a deeply marked, utterly defeated, pathetic woman. But in the absolute, dead silence of the towering mountains, completely far away from the greedy cameras and the toxic judgments, she was actively, aggressively gestating a massive master plan, a completely brand new, untouchable way of life. One late afternoon, while aggressively hiking down a steep, dirt forest trail. She unexpectedly encountered a small group of highly resilient local peasant women who were heavily carrying massive stacks of chopped firewood on their exhausted, aching backs. When they saw her, they absolutely did not judge her. They didn't stare at her with toxic, morbid curiosity. One of the older women simply offered a warm, genuine smile and said, "You are the incredibly brave one, aren't you? The fierce one who successfully survived that brutal hit." That simple, profound sentence stopped Victoria completely dead in her tracks. They absolutely did not view her as a pathetic, broken victim. They viewed her exactly as someone who had fiercely, miraculously survived something incredibly terrible. That tiny, deeply powerful interaction aggressively planted a massive seed in her brilliant mind. A highly dangerous, powerful idea that aggressively began to germinate with terrifying force, returning to the cabin. Victoria intensely stared at her own reflection in the mirror she had finally, bravely uncovered. She heavily observed her completely healed face, which now bore a highly hardened, incredibly serious, unbreakable expression. She was absolutely no longer anyone's submissive wife. She was absolutely no longer the obedient, pathetic daughter. She was a fierce, untouchable survivor who possessed a massive, pending debt with herself and with absolute justice. She profoundly knew she couldn't cowardly hide in the mountains forever, pathetically hiding from the monster who had violently hurt her. She aggressively had to go back down. She had to violently face the toxic world again. But absolutely not as the pathetic, terrified girl who ran away crying. The freezing wind blew incredibly hard that night, violently rattling the heavy glass windows, but she felt absolutely zero fear. She felt incredibly, strangely calm. Exactly like the terrifying, dead eye of a massive hurricane, right before it violently makes landfall and destroys everything. She aggressively opened the dark drawer where she had cowardly hidden her smartphone weeks ago. She violently grabbed it and aggressively pressed the power button, intensely watching the bright Apple logo illuminate the pitch-black room. As the expensive device vibrated uncontrollably, with literally thousands of highly delayed, frantic notifications, she smiled slightly. A terrifying, incredibly cold smile that absolutely did not reach her eyes. The pathetic time for weak mourning was permanently over. It was officially time for the entire world to aggressively hear her true, unbreakable voice. Interactive question. Victoria is finally taking her power back. What is the most empowering thing you've ever done after a major setback? Share below. The Rebirth and the Phoenix Foundation. Exactly 6 agonizing months had violently passed since that catastrophic, fateful Saturday in Beaufort. The freezing, bitter winter had fully arrived in the region, aggressively covering the massive hills in a thick, freezing gray fog. In the state capital, completely far away from the toxic small-town gossip and the highly curious, judgmental stares of nosy neighbors, a massive, elite television studio was aggressively preparing for a highly anticipated, exclusive special broadcast. The stressed technicians were frantically adjusting the heavy microphones and blinding studio lights, desperately trying to create an incredibly intimate, yet highly professional environment for the absolute most highly anticipated, explosive interview of the entire year. Absolutely everyone in the nation desperately wanted to see exactly what had happened to the assaulted bride. The greedy audience was completely, morbidly expecting to find an utterly destroyed, pathetically weeping victim cowardly crying in front of the HD cameras. But when Victoria Kensington confidently strode onto the massive studio set, the absolute silence became so incredibly dense and heavy that you could clearly hear the low electrical hum of the massive spotlights near the towering ceiling. She absolutely was not wearing pathetic dark mourning clothes, nor was she wearing baggy, oversized garments to cowardly hide her figure. She was wearing a breathtaking, flawlessly tailored, deep burgundy designer power suit that perfectly accentuated her incredibly strong, imposing figure, violently projecting a brand new, terrifyingly untouchable level of absolute security. She had aggressively chopped off her hair, completely discarding the incredibly long, romantic flowing locks from her pathetic wedding day. She had fiercely opted for a highly modern, incredibly sharp, practical bob cut that aggressively hardened her striking features. She confidently marched directly to the designated interview chair with a fierce, incredibly powerful stride, formally greeting the famous anchorwoman with a firm, bone-crushing handshake that heavily denoted massive strength and pure determination. Absolutely zero fear. The highly anticipated interview officially began with the standard, highly predictable, pathetic questions from the host about exactly how she was emotionally feeling and exactly what she had been secretly doing during her entire, massive public absence. Victoria stared aggressively, directly into the massive lens of the primary camera, violently breaking the fourth wall. She absolutely wasn't speaking to the pathetic interviewer. She was aggressively speaking directly to the millions of terrified women watching safely from their own living rooms. I aggressively went to briefly die in the freezing mountains so that I could violently, fiercely be born again, she stated. Her deep, highly resonant, completely steady voice utterly shocked absolutely everyone in the massive studio. There were absolutely zero pathetic tears in her beautiful eyes. Only an incredibly striking, terrifyingly absolute clarity that instantly, violently disarmed the highly sensationalist, greedy intentions of the television program. She spoke deeply and profoundly of the agonizing months of crippling depression, of the highly toxic, crushing shame that had cowardly kept her locked away in the dark, and exactly how the fierce, unbreakable support of her powerful grandmother and the incredibly brave local women had miraculously, aggressively saved her life. She powerfully recounted exactly how she had violently transformed her agonizing pain into high-octane rocket fuel, how she aggressively spent her time reading massive, complex books on federal law and human rights, intensely educating herself to completely, profoundly understand that she was absolutely, 100% not to blame for Alexander's disgusting, violent abuse. Society toxically teaches us to quietly endure, to force a fake smile for the pretty picture, to absolutely never, ever irritate the powerful man. And that highly toxic, disgusting garbage almost violently cost me my entire life, she declared with pure, unbreakable firmness. Her heavy, powerful words resonated violently in millions of living rooms across the entire nation, deeply discomforting the toxic abusers and massively, aggressively empowering millions more. But Victoria absolutely wasn't just there to pathetically recount her tragic personal story, or to easily score cheap, easy sympathy from a greedy television audience. She aggressively hijacked the massive, primetime television slot to formally, officially announce the creation of her brand new, massive nonprofit organization, the Phoenix Foundation, a highly funded, massive legal entity exclusively dedicated to providing elite, free legal counsel and highly advanced psychological support to abused women trapped in remote rural areas. I absolutely fiercely refuse to let any other innocent bride ever arrogantly believe that a violent slap is just a simple mistake or a pathetic display of strong male character, she explicitly explained with blinding, pure passion. She proudly held up the highly official, federal legal documents of the massive organization directly to the cameras, flawlessly demonstrating that this was absolutely not a fleeting, emotional whim, but a highly serious, heavily funded, incredibly structured, massive corporate project. The massive reaction on social media was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly overwhelming. The powerful hashtag Victoria the Phoenix instantly, aggressively began to completely flood Twitter and Facebook, rapidly displacing the toxic, mocking memes from 6 months ago. Thousands of women began aggressively sharing their own horrific stories of violent abuse, massively inspired by the terrifying courage of someone who had been violently, publicly humiliated and had fiercely, proudly risen from the ashes. The horrific video of the slap, which was previously a highly toxic source of morbid entertainment, was instantly, violently recontextualized as the absolute, undeniable origin of a massive, legitimate, highly necessary social movement. Victoria Kensington was actively, aggressively changing the global narrative from a pathetic, passive victim into a fierce, highly resilient, untouchable leader in real time. The absolute microsecond the explosive interview ended, the massive switchboard of the foundation, which had literally just been connected that exact morning, began aggressively ringing off the hook in the small, highly secure office they had rented. It was terrified women from neighboring towns, from highly isolated, forgotten farms, desperately begging for urgent help, vital legal advice, or simply desperately needing someone to just listen to them without highly toxic judgment. Victoria, upon walking out of the massive TV station, aggressively headed straight to the temporary headquarters. She violently rolled up the sleeves of her expensive silk shirt and began personally, aggressively, answering the frantic calls alongside 2 highly dedicated, volunteer female lawyers. She absolutely did not sleep a single wink that night. But absolutely not because of terrifying nightmares. It was entirely fueled by the massive, blinding adrenaline of finally knowing she was incredibly useful and utterly, terrifyingly powerful. Back in Beaufort, the explosive news of Victoria's highly triumphant media return dropped exactly like a massive nuclear bomb directly onto the Caldwell family mansion. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell sat staring at her massive flat-screen television, with her jaw literally hanging wide open, utterly incapable of comprehending that the highly confident, incredibly eloquent, terrifyingly powerful woman on the screen was the exact same timid, submissive daughter-in-law she had maliciously despised. Alexander's wealthy, arrogant friends, who had previously toxically mocked the horrific situation while drinking expensive scotch at the elite country club, now sat in absolute, terrified silence. They were deeply intimidated by the massive, impenetrable moral force that Victoria now aggressively projected. They profoundly knew with absolute certainty that she was absolutely no longer easy, pathetic prey. She was now a highly real, massive, lethal threat to the toxic system of wealthy impunity that actively protected them. Victoria immediately began aggressively traveling throughout the neighboring municipalities, delivering highly powerful, explosive lectures in high schools and massive community centers, absolutely always heavily escorted by her elite, private security team and her proud father. She absolutely refused to charge a single dime for the massive conferences. Her ultimate, priceless payment was physically watching the deep, blinding terror completely vanish from the women's eyes the absolute second they heard her fiercely speak about true freedom. She rapidly became an incredibly uncomfortable, highly dangerous figure for the corrupt local authorities, from whom she aggressively demanded immediate, tangible results in highly stalled, ignored domestic violence investigations. If you absolutely refuse to do your damn job, we will aggressively, publicly expose you to the entire nation, she fiercely warned the corrupt police chiefs in highly tense, closed-door meetings, absolutely refusing to lower her piercing gaze for a single microsecond. One highly specific case permanently marked her absolute consolidation as an untouchable leader. An 18-year-old girl named Lily had been violently assaulted by her wealthy boyfriend at a local high society party. The corrupt local police violently refused to officially register the criminal complaint, toxically arguing that it was just a silly lovers' quarrel and that there was absolutely no need to massively exaggerate things. Victoria Kensington aggressively stormed directly into the local police precinct, heavily flanked by her elite legal team, actively broadcasting a highly viral live stream directly from her smartphone, aggressively demanding absolute, immediate justice for Lily. The massive public pressure was so incredibly overwhelming that the wealthy abuser was violently arrested and thrown into a cell in less than 2 hours. The entire city, finally, vividly, saw the absolute, terrifying power of her massive organization. Her beautiful face began aggressively appearing on massive, urban street murals, beautifully painted exactly like a modern-day saint, holding a massive megaphone instead of a traditional rosary, entirely surrounded by beautiful, fierce violet flowers. The toxic, highly misogynistic men of the city quietly, cowardly called her the bitter bitch or the angry feminist. But they absolutely did not dare to ever say it directly to her face, utterly terrified of being aggressively, publicly exposed and ruined. She completely, utterly ignored the pathetic insults, remaining entirely, fiercely focused on her massive mission, physically feeling that every single terrified woman she successfully helped miraculously healed a tiny piece of her own deep, internal wound. The massive, invisible scar on her soul was permanently closing, not with pathetic forgetfulness, but with aggressive action and absolute justice. Victoria's physical transformation was also incredibly evident. She had successfully gained healthy weight and built dense, lean muscle. She looked incredibly vibrant, completely filled with a highly infectious, radiating energy that magnetically attracted people. She absolutely no longer walked with a submissive, hunched posture. She walked with her back perfectly straight, her head held incredibly high, aggressively occupying the exact massive space in the world that she rightfully deserved. Her beautiful, loud laughter, which had been completely, violently silenced for agonizing months, was finally, joyfully heard again in the busy strategy meetings. A massive, strong, highly genuine laugh. She had profoundly discovered that true, absolute happiness absolutely did not depend on possessing a wealthy husband, nor on having a perfect, high society marriage. It depended entirely on being the absolute, unquestionable master of her own destiny. However, absolutely everything wasn't just massive success and loud applause. Highly toxic, anonymous death threats aggressively began arriving at the Foundation's headquarters in unmarked, cheap envelopes. Creepy ransom-style notes created from cut-out magazine letters containing terrifying messages like, "Shut your mouth," or "We will violently silence you." Highly disturbing photographs of her face with the eyes violently crossed out in thick red marker were aggressively shoved under the heavy office door. Her father desperately, tearfully, begged her to be incredibly careful, frantically warning her not to aggressively provoke the highly dangerous, powerful men who actively protected the wealthy abusers in the region. But Victoria simply, calmly filed the terrifying threats into a highly secure, special folder, aggressively utilizing them as absolute, undeniable evidence that she was successfully striking the exact right nerves of the deeply rotten, toxic system. One rainy afternoon, while aggressively reviewing complex legal briefs, She received an unexpected visit from a highly timid older woman, dressed incredibly humbly. It turned out to be the former, longtime head housekeeper of Alexander's massive family mansion. The older woman, highly nervous and frantically looking over her shoulder, completely confessed to Victoria that Alexander had absolutely always been incredibly, terrifyingly violent. She explicitly revealed that he regularly physically abused his own mother and violently tortured animals. She told horrifying, graphic tales of absolute terror that occurred completely hidden behind the massive iron gates of the luxury mansion, absolutely confirming that Victoria had miraculously, violently escaped a significantly more horrific, deadly fate. This highly explosive, brand new information gave Victoria an entirely new, massive perspective. Alexander wasn't just a man who had a momentary lapse of judgment due to alcohol. He was a highly systematic, terrifying, cold-blooded predator. Armed with this massive new information, Victoria fiercely decided to violently expand her massive crusade. Not only aggressively supporting the victims, but intensely, publicly pressuring the federal district attorney to actively, aggressively hunt down Alexander. She aggressively launched a massive, highly viral social media campaign titled, "Where is the Abuser?" prominently featuring high-definition photos of her ex-husband and highly secure, anonymous tip line numbers. Alexander's face was violently plastered absolutely everywhere on Facebook again. But this time, absolutely not as a pathetic, funny meme, but as a highly dangerous federal fugitive actively wanted by society. The massive public pressure on his wealthy family became utterly, completely unbearable. Their massive corporate businesses aggressively began to suffer massive, highly damaging public boycotts from the entire community. Victoria's personal life also aggressively began to beautifully blossom. She met a highly intelligent, incredibly brilliant human rights lawyer named Carter. He was an incredibly calm, deeply respectful man who profoundly admired her fierce, unbreakable fight. Although she was absolutely not emotionally ready for a romantic relationship, she found in him an incredibly solid, beautiful friendship and a highly stimulating intellectual support that she had absolutely never, ever experienced with Alexander. Carter aggressively helped her flawlessly draft the complex legal complaints and fiercely accompanied her to the highly stressful court hearings, rapidly converting into her absolute, trusted right-hand man and closest confidant. For the absolute first time in her life, Victoria experienced exactly what it was like to have a powerful man standing right by her side, who absolutely didn't want to toxically control her, but who desperately wanted to aggressively propel her forward. The massive, undeniable success of the Phoenix Foundation rapidly attracted the highly toxic attention of opportunistic, corrupt local politicians who desperately wanted to aggressively take PR photos with her to secure cheap votes in the upcoming local elections. Victoria received them with absolute, freezing coldness. She aggressively accepted their massive funding, if and only if it went directly to the victims, but she violently, publicly refused to endorse or raise the hand of any corrupt, toxic candidate. "My absolute only political party is the fierce protection of women. Absolutely not your toxic, fake colors," she stated coldly, leaving them completely, utterly baffled by her absolute, unbribable integrity. She learned incredibly fast exactly how to flawlessly navigate the highly toxic, murky waters of corrupt politics without ever getting her hands dirty, fiercely maintaining her absolute autonomy at all costs. Upon the exact first anniversary of the catastrophic, failed wedding, Victoria flawlessly organized a massive, highly symbolic, silent march directly from the steps of the church straight to the main city square. Hundreds of powerful women, all dressed flawlessly in pristine white and holding bright, flickering candles, marched fiercely alongside her in a highly solemn, terrifyingly powerful procession that beautifully illuminated the dark night of the city. There was absolutely no violent screaming, zero pathetic vandalism, just a massive, highly compact, impenetrable wall of pure female dignity, aggressively demanding absolute safety and pure respect in the streets and in their homes. Upon finally reaching the exact stone steps where she had been brutally assaulted, Victoria gracefully, gently placed a single, pristine white rose directly onto the cold stone, highly symbolically, permanently closing an agonizing cycle of pure pain. From the high balcony of the massive city hall, the terrified local mayor watched the massive demonstration with deep, profound concern, horrifyingly realizing that Victoria currently possessed significantly more massive convening power than he ever did. The entire town had permanently, violently changed. Women absolutely no longer submissively lowered their heads when their toxic husbands aggressively raised their voices in the local supermarket. There was a massive, highly palpable brand new consciousness aggressively floating in the air. A fierce, highly charged static electricity that aggressively foreshadowed massive, profound, structural changes in the entire social fabric of the region. And absolutely all of it had violently started with a single, brutal slap that was maliciously intended to publicly humiliate a woman, and had ultimately, miraculously, ended up violently awakening them all. Interactive question. Victoria turned her trauma into a massive movement. If you could start a foundation, what cause would you fight for? Let us know below. The return of the coward. But absolute peace is an incredibly fragile state when there are massive, unpaid debts, and the toxic past has a highly disgusting habit of violently returning when you least expect it. While Victoria was delivering the highly explosive closing speech of the massive march, she physically felt a terrifying, freezing shiver violently run down her spine. It was the highly primal, instinctive sensation of being aggressively watched with pure, unadulterated hatred. She frantically searched the massive crowd, aggressively scanning the dark shadows of the ancient trees in the square, but she only saw the warm, friendly faces and the flickering candles. She quickly told herself it was just toxic paranoia, that she was perfectly safe, heavily surrounded by her loyal people and her massive, impenetrable fortress. What Victoria absolutely did not know was that exactly 50 miles away, in a filthy, highly disgusting, cheap roadside motel, right near the state border, a terrifying man was aggressively watching the live broadcast of the massive march on a highly cracked, cheap smartphone screen. Alexander. He possessed a massive, unkempt, wild beard. He was incredibly, horrifyingly thin, and possessed a highly emaciated, sickly appearance from agonizing months of cowardly running from the law and abusing highly toxic substances. He stared obsessively, with pure, psychotic hatred, at the glowing image of his triumphant, powerful ex-wife. White-hot, blinding rage aggressively corroded his very entrails upon seeing her looking so incredibly strong, so utterly, perfectly in control of her massive destiny, while he was pathetically living exactly like a filthy, hidden rat. He violently crushed an empty, cheap beer can with his bare hand, physically feeling the sharp aluminum completely yield under his massive frustration, and aggressively muttered highly toxic curses at the glowing screen. He literally could not stand the massive, agonizing fact that she had successfully, brilliantly, converted his toxic mistake into a massive, golden staircase to absolute success, while he had violently, permanently lost absolutely everything: his massive wealth, his elite family, and his pristine reputation. In his highly twisted, psychotic mind, she had maliciously stolen his perfect life, and he was absolutely, violently determined to aggressively take it back, or completely, utterly destroy her in the attempt. The massive, crushing public humiliation he was currently feeling was an engine exactly as powerful as hers, but entirely fueled by the absolute darkest, most toxic resentment imaginable. Alexander aggressively stood up from the filthy, stained mattress. He violently grabbed a highly worn, cheap backpack and glared at his pathetic reflection in the filthy, stained bathroom mirror, barely even recognizing the elite, arrogant billionaire he once was. "Enjoy your pathetic 15 minutes of fame, Victoria," he whispered to the absolute solitude of the disgusting room, an incredibly crooked, terrifying smile spreading across his face that foreshadowed absolutely nothing good. "Because incredibly soon, I am aggressively returning to Beaufort, and this time, it absolutely won't be to get married." He violently clicked the cheap phone off, completely cutting off the beautiful image of the woman who was reborn, and aggressively stepped out into the freezing, pitch-black night, completely, violently determined to put a permanent, brutal end to her massive party. The pathetic villain of the story was entirely sick and tired of cowardly hiding, and he was completely, violently ready to aggressively reclaim the massive spotlight he arrogantly believed he still deserved. The fragile, beautiful calm in Beaufort was about to be violently shattered once again, and the absolute, ultimate, terrifying test for the brand new Victoria was only just aggressively beginning. The pathetic showdown, the highly run-down, cheap economy bus violently braked with a loud, aggressive, high-pitched squeal at the dusty, filthy terminal in Beaufort, kicking up a massive cloud of thick, gray dirt that completely covered the few unfortunate passengers waiting nearby. From the rusting back door, an incredibly thin, pathetic-looking man heavily stepped down. He was wearing highly worn, faded clothes that had once been expensive designer brands, desperately attempting to cowardly hide his identity under a filthy, cheap baseball cap and highly fake, knockoff sunglasses. Alexander stepped onto the sacred ground of his hometown. Absolutely not as the arrogant, elite crown prince who had violently fled, but as a completely ruined, pathetic outsider carrying his absolute entire net worth stuffed into a cheap, dirty gym bag. Absolutely no one recognized him at first. His highly arrogant, towering stride had completely vanished, permanently replaced by a highly hunched, defensive, pathetic posture, typical of a paranoid man who had spent agonizing months constantly, terrifiedly looking over his shoulder. He aggressively walked down the highly secluded side streets to desperately avoid the busy city center, bitterly, highly toxically, noticing exactly how the beautiful city had subtly, massively changed during his forced, pathetic exile. On every single corner, he violently saw bright violet posters featuring the bold logo of the Phoenix Foundation, a massive, constant reminder that his ex-wife had successfully, aggressively transformed into the absolute moral compass of the entire region. Walking past a massive brick wall, he abruptly, violently, stopped upon seeing a breathtaking, massive mural brilliantly painted with highly vibrant colors. It flawlessly depicted the beautiful face of Victoria, looking powerfully toward the bright horizon with pure, unadulterated hope. He physically felt a massive, highly corrosive stab of pure, toxic envy in his gut. She was the absolute celebrated hero of the incredible story, and he was the pathetic, exiled villain who had to cowardly hide in the shadows. He finally reached his massive family mansion, desperately hoping to find a safe refuge and highly accessible, easy cash. Instead, he violently encountered a massive heavy iron gate, securely locked with thick, heavy chains, and a highly rusted padlock that loudly evidenced total, permanent abandonment. He aggressively jumped the high back wall with extreme difficulty, violently tearing his cheap pants. He found the massive, beautiful garden his mother used to obsessively tend, transformed into a horrifying, untamed jungle of dry, thorny weeds. The massive estate was completely, utterly empty. The incredibly expensive furniture was entirely covered with thick white sheets, looking exactly like dead ghosts. The deafening, absolute silence, echoing in the long corridors, was a massive, mute accusation of the absolute ruin he had maliciously caused. His elite family had aggressively, cowardly, fled to the capital city to desperately escape the crushing social shame, intentionally leaving him completely, utterly alone with the terrifying echoes of his highly privileged, dead past. Completely penniless and possessing absolutely zero allies, Alexander was violently forced to seek pathetic shelter in a disgusting, fifth-rate boarding house on the absolute worst outskirts of town, where the walls were literally made of cheap cardboard and the freezing water barely trickled from the rusted faucet. Lying heavily on the rock-hard, filthy mattress, he aggressively schemed his toxic master plan with the absolute desperation of a cornered, feral animal that perfectly knows it has absolutely no other viable option left but to violently attack. He knew with absolute certainty that he absolutely could not win by pure physical force. Victoria now possessed massive power and highly loyal people who fiercely protected her. So, he aggressively had to utilize a completely different, highly subtle, incredibly venomous tactic. He aggressively decided to maliciously play the pathetic pity card, arrogantly betting that the highly sentimental, forgiving Southern public would blindly forgive the pathetic prodigal son if he just cowardly cried hard enough. The very next morning, he used the absolute last few coins he possessed to aggressively call a highly corrupt, local tabloid journalist, heavily known for his total lack of basic ethics. "I possess the absolute massive exclusive you have been desperately waiting for," Alexander stated, his voice incredibly hoarse and highly dramatic. "The violent groom from the infamous wedding desperately wants to publicly confess his absolute truth and pathetically beg for public forgiveness." The greedy journalist, instantly smelling massive amounts of easy money and explosive scandal, immediately eagerly agreed to rapidly organize a highly improvised, chaotic press conference directly in the massive gazebo in the absolute center of the main square. Alexander smirked toxically as he hung up the phone. He arrogantly, fully knew that highly toxic, morbid curiosity was infinitely stronger than pure justice, and that the greedy public would desperately want to witness the pathetic spectacle. He meticulously, aggressively prepared for his pathetic performance with the extreme care of a highly manipulative theater actor. He shaved his wild, unkempt beard with a cheap, disposable razor, but highly intentionally left his massive, dark under-eye circles completely natural to look incredibly, pathetically suffered. He put on a highly wrinkled white dress shirt, the absolute only somewhat clean one he owned, but intentionally left the collar unbuttoned to aggressively project a highly fake image of pure humility and simple repentance, completely far away from the massive arrogance he displayed at the wedding. He aggressively rehearsed his highly fake, pathetic gestures of deep remorse in front of the cracked, filthy bathroom mirror. He practically practiced exactly how to submissively lower his gaze and exactly how to violently crack his voice at the highly critical, emotional moments. He felt absolutely zero, real, genuine remorse in his cold heart. Only a massive, urgent, desperate need to aggressively clean his toxic image so he could successfully return to making massive business deals and violently recover his elite status. The highly explosive news of his sudden return leaked significantly before the scheduled time. The massive rumor aggressively spread exactly like a trail of lit gunpowder through the local market, the high schools, and the government offices. "Did you hear? That absolute bastard actually came back!" the angry neighbors gossiped, completely abandoning their daily shopping to aggressively rush to the main square with a highly toxic mixture of pure indignation and morbid curiosity. The wealthy men of the city, many of whom had previously publicly condemned Alexander, now desperately wanted to see if he actually had the massive audacity to show his pathetic face. The massive square rapidly filled up, quickly creating a highly electric, terrifyingly tense atmosphere. Exactly like the dead, suffocating calm, right before a massive, violent hurricane. Back at the highly secure Foundation headquarters, Victoria received the explosive news directly through Carter, who aggressively burst into her office, his face pure ghost white, tightly gripping his phone, absolutely terrified of her reaction. "He is officially here, Victoria. Alexander is currently in the city. He aggressively called the local media to the main square for a press conference starting in exactly 1 hour, he said incredibly softly. Victoria completely froze for one single, terrifying second. She physically felt the solid floor violently shift beneath her feet, aggressively, vividly reliving the visceral, blinding terror of that horrific day at the church. But this time, she took a massive, incredibly deep breath. She slowly looked down at her hands, which were absolutely not trembling even a single millimeter, and profoundly realized that the blinding fear had been completely, permanently replaced by an incredibly cold, razor-sharp determination. "We are absolutely not hiding Carter. If he desperately wants a pathetic show, we are going to violently give him a massive dose of absolute reality," she replied, aggressively standing up and flawlessly smoothing out her expensive designer blazer. Grandma Beatrice, who was currently visiting the office, desperately tried to stop her, aggressively arguing that it was highly dangerous, that the man was incredibly unpredictable and highly violent. "Grandma, I am absolutely no longer the pathetic, terrified little girl who cowardly ran away to the mountains. If I absolutely do not violently face him today, he will aggressively haunt me for the rest of my entire life," Victoria sentenced, with absolute, pure steel. She rapidly gave incredibly strict instructions to her elite security team to fiercely accompany her. Absolutely not as defensive bodyguards, but as powerful, physical witnesses to perfectly ensure that she absolutely would not yield a single inch of her massive ground. Meanwhile, at the massive square, Alexander confidently climbed up into the large wooden gazebo, heavily surrounded by cheap microphones and dozens of glowing smartphone cameras pointed directly at him, exactly like loaded weapons, fully ready to violently fire. The loud, chaotic murmur of the massive crowd abruptly, violently ceased when he aggressively raised his hands in a highly fake, pathetic gesture of peace, completely showing his empty palms. "People of Beaufort, I fully, deeply know that you absolutely hate me, and you are 100% right to do so," he began, aggressively speaking with a voice that sounded incredibly broken and deeply pained. "I have violently lived in absolute hell for these last agonizing months, heavily punished by my own guilty conscience and by the absolute, catastrophic mistake of my entire life. I am absolutely not here to pathetically justify myself, he continued, looking directly into the massive cameras with highly fake, tear-filled eyes. I am here to explicitly state that the toxic alcohol and my dark internal demons completely defeated me on that horrific day. He so aggressively began spouting pathetic lies about supposed childhood traumas, massive family depressions, and an undiagnosed, highly severe mental illness, seamlessly weaving a highly toxic web of pathetic excuses cleverly disguised as brave confessions. Some of the older, highly gullible women in the crowd, deeply moved by his highly emaciated, pathetic appearance, actually began to loudly murmur, "Oh, the poor broken boy," completely falling for the highly emotional, toxic trap he had brilliantly set. Alexander, instantly noticing the massive shift in the audience's energy, felt significantly more secure and aggressively doubled down on his toxic bet. I only desperately ask for exactly one single opportunity, just to see my beautiful wife, my Victoria, and to pathetically beg for her forgiveness on my knees, as a broken man who catastrophically failed, but who desperately wants to completely change, he exclaimed with massive theatrical drama. He profoundly knew that by deliberately calling her my wife, he was aggressively marking his toxic territory, loudly reminding absolutely everyone that they were technically, legally, still bound by a piece of paper. The massive crowd violently divided. Some aggressively booed, loudly screaming, "Cynical bastard!" while others actively demanded silence to hear the rest of his pathetic speech. The master manipulator was actively achieving his toxic goal, heavily sowing deep doubt and violently dividing the public opinion that had previously been 100% unanimous. And it was in that exact, highly tense moment that the massive crowd parted exactly like the Red Sea. They actively created a highly silent, clear path through which Victoria confidently advanced with an incredibly firm, terrifyingly powerful stride. She absolutely did not carry weapons. She didn't violently scream. She was armed entirely with her highly imposing presence and the absolute, unbreakable dignity she had meticulously reconstructed, brick by broken brick, during her massive absence. She was flawlessly dressed entirely in pristine white, exactly as she was on her wedding day. But this time, it was a highly modern, incredibly sharp designer pantsuit that violently projected absolute terrifying authority, absolutely not weak submission. She slowly, confidently ascended the stairs of the gazebo. She never took her piercing, lethal eyes off Alexander, who instinctively, violently took a terrified step backward the absolute microsecond he saw her. The silence in the massive square was absolute. It was so incredibly dense that you could clearly hear the flapping wings of the doves in the nearby trees. Alexander desperately tried to regain his toxic control. He aggressively extended his arms toward her with a highly rehearsed, pathetic, sad smile. "Victoria, my absolute love, thank you so incredibly much for coming. Just look at me. Look at how utterly broken I am. I have deeply, agonizingly paid for my massive guilt," he said, desperately attempting to step closer for a highly public, pathetic hug that could be captured by the flashing cameras. He desperately needed that specific photo, the image of the beautiful reconciliation, or at least a highly public forgiveness, to completely clean his toxic name and immediately return to elite society. Victoria aggressively raised exactly one hand. She stopped him violently, dead in his tracks, exactly 6 feet away, creating a massive, invisible, but utterly impenetrable brick wall right between them. She absolutely did not smile. She did not cry. She simply observed him with a highly clinical, terrifying coldness, exactly as if she were deeply analyzing a disgusting, pathetic insect under a high-powered microscope. "Your guilt?" she asked. Her voice was incredibly clear and massively powerful, requiring absolutely zero microphone, effortlessly projecting her words so the entire massive square could perfectly hear. "You absolutely are not here to pathetically beg for forgiveness, Alexander. You are strictly here to beg us to give you back the comfortable, elite luxury that you violently lost." "Do absolutely not say that, baby. I swear to God, I have completely changed. True love can conquer absolutely anything," he desperately insisted, visibly seeing his highly rehearsed, fake script violently crumbling in the face of her absolute reality. He pathetically attempted to drop to his knees, desperately seeking the highly dramatic, theatrical effect he had meticulously planned. But the movement seemed incredibly clumsy and highly forced in the face of her incredibly straight, untouchable posture. The massive crowd finally, rapidly began to clearly see through the toxic farce. The massive, glaring difference between the highly real, unbreakable dignity of Victoria and the cheap, pathetic, bad acting of Alexander was utterly abysmal. True love absolutely does not hit, Alexander. True love absolutely does not violently humiliate a person in front of an entire city, Victoria replied, and her heavy words aggressively dropped exactly like massive, crushing boulders directly onto the conscience of absolutely everyone present. "And do absolutely not ever call me baby. I am Victoria Kensington, the fierce, unbreakable woman who successfully, violently, survived your pathetic love." The entire massive square violently exploded into spontaneous, deafening applause. They wildly cheered for the powerful woman who aggressively refused to be toxically manipulated ever again. Alexander's handsome face violently transformed. The highly fake mask of pure repentance completely slipped for one single microsecond, terrifyingly revealing the massive, boiling rage he actively carried inside. The corrupt, cheap journalist desperately tried to aggressively intervene to magically save his exclusive interview. "Ma'am, do you honestly not believe in Christian forgiveness? Look at him. He is clearly, deeply suffering." Victoria violently spun toward the camera, absolutely obliterating the pathetic reporter with a single, lethal glare. Personal forgiveness is a highly private matter, but absolute justice is a highly public matter, and exactly what he violently did to me was absolutely not a simple sin. It was a massive federal crime, she sentenced with pure steel. With that single, explosive sentence, she completely dismantled his toxic narrative of a simple couple's quarrel and aggressively relocated the entire situation directly into the brutal criminal realm, exactly where it rightfully belonged. Alexander, visually seeing himself completely cornered and brutally, publicly humiliated once again, physically felt the blinding rage violently climb up his neck, highly heating his face. "You aggressively provoked me exactly like you did that time," he violently screamed, completely, utterly forgetting his highly rehearsed role as the pathetic, repentant victim. He aggressively displayed his true, terrifyingly violent nature directly in front of the dozens of HD cameras that were still actively recording. The massive crowd audibly gasped in pure horror upon witnessing the rapid, terrifying transformation. The pathetic, crying victim had completely vanished, and the violent, horrific monster was officially back. Victoria absolutely did not retreat a single, microscopic millimeter. She had been highly expecting this exact, violent reaction to flawlessly expose him. "Right there," Victoria stated with terrifying, absolute calm, aggressively pointing directly at him. "That is the real, authentic, Alexander, the exact monster who aggressively blames absolutely everyone else for his own violent abuse. The local police officers, who had been quietly, nervously observing from the very edge of the square, began aggressively moving directly toward the gazebo upon seeing the situation turn highly aggressive. Alexander looked wildly around, horrifyingly realizing that he had completely, blindly fallen into his own highly toxic trap. That by desperately seeking public attention, he had absolutely only succeeded in publicly, undeniably confirming his own horrific guilt in front of the entire world. Desperate, Alexander aggressively looked for a rapid escape route. But he was heavily surrounded by the massive crowd, who were now glaring at him with open, unadulterated hostility. "This is absolutely not going to stay like this. You are mine," he violently threatened, aggressively throwing a wild, blind punch into the empty air that absolutely didn't hit anyone, but definitively, permanently sealed his toxic social fate. Victoria stood perfectly, incredibly firm, exactly like an untouchable statue of pure justice, while two massive, heavily armed officers confidently climbed into the gazebo to aggressively invite him to step down for his own physical safety. Alexander's massive, public humiliation was total and complete. But this time, it was absolutely not because of a viral gossip video. It was entirely because of his own pathetic inability to control his highly toxic, violent temper. As the officers aggressively escorted him directly toward a waiting patrol car to actively prevent the furious crowd from violently lynching him, Alexander glared back at Victoria with pure, distilled, white-hot hatred. She fiercely held his toxic gaze until the absolute very last second, flawlessly demonstrating that he absolutely no longer possessed a single ounce of power over her. However, as the heavy police cruiser violently sped away, Victoria suddenly felt a slight, dizzying wave of intense nausea. She had to heavily lean against the wooden railing of the gazebo for support. Carter instantly sprinted forward to catch her, deeply concerned by her sudden, ghost-white pallor. "Are you okay? That was way too incredibly intense," her friend and elite lawyer asked, rapidly offering her a bottle of water. Victoria nodded, taking a massive, deep breath of air. But she profoundly knew that the dizziness absolutely wasn't just from the intense adrenaline. She instinctively, gently brought her hand down to rest directly on her lower abdomen. It was a highly subtle, incredibly private gesture that went completely unnoticed by the vast majority of the crowd, but absolutely not by the massive television cameras zooming in heavily on her face. There was a massive, highly explosive secret she was fiercely guarding, something that would permanently, violently, change the entire rules of the massive game. The massive crowd began to slowly disperse, loudly, enthusiastically discussing the incredible bravery of the boss, as they had highly respectfully begun to call her. But the massive drama was absolutely not over. Alexander was only temporarily detained for disturbing the peace. He would be out on bail incredibly soon. The massive war had been openly, formally declared, and Victoria profoundly knew she had to aggressively play her absolute final lethal card, one that absolutely no one in the entire city, not even Alexander, could ever see coming. Interactive question. He played the victim and failed miserably. What do you think Victoria's big secret is? Let us know below. The pregnancy and the denial of the name. The bright sun aggressively began to set over Beaufort, beautifully painting the sky in breathtaking shades of deep orange and bright violet, the exact official colors of Victoria's massive foundation. She gracefully stepped down from the gazebo amidst massive, thunderous applause, but her brilliant mind was completely elsewhere. She was meticulously, coldly calculating the exact timing, the massive risks, and the highly explosive consequences of the terrifying revelation she was about to make. The pathetic return of the guilty abuser had catastrophically failed. But the true, absolute ultimate revenge of the victim was only just about to be violently unleashed upon the world. Alexander confidently strutted out of the local police precinct, holding cell just exactly 24 hours after the massive chaos in the square. He was aggressively walking with the renewed, highly toxic arrogance of a wealthy man who deeply knows that massive amounts of cash can easily unlock any rusted iron gate. His highly expensive, bald, heavily sweating lawyer from the capital city had aggressively argued that his client was severely emotionally provoked and that his arrest was entirely illegal. Stepping out onto this dirty street, Alexander aggressively adjusted his wrinkled shirt collar and glared with pure, unadulterated disgust at the few curious bystanders remaining. He aggressively spat on the filthy sidewalk, exactly as if he were a feral dog marking his toxic territory. In his highly twisted, psychotic mind, the catastrophic incident at the gazebo absolutely had not been a massive defeat. It was purely proof that he still possessed the terrifying power to completely alter Victoria's peaceful reality simply with his physical presence. He aggressively took refuge in a highly secluded, expensive rental house on the outskirts of town, staying completely away from the highly judging, toxic stares of the city center. He violently transformed the luxury rental into his own personal, massive war room against his ex-wife. He spent the agonizing, long nights aggressively drinking cheap whiskey and obsessively, psychotically reviewing the massive divorce papers. He was desperately, frantically searching for absolutely any hidden, complex legal clause he could exploit to leave her completely homeless on the freezing street. "I am absolutely not giving that bitch a single damn penny, counselor. I aggressively want her to legally return every single pathetic gift I ever gave her," he violently screamed at his exhausted lawyer. His toxic strategy was incredibly clear: brutally, financially asphyxiate her until she was violently forced to crawl back to him on her knees, pathetically begging for pure mercy just so she could afford to eat. Victoria, however, was aggressively playing a completely different, highly advanced game of 4D chess. One where the massive pieces absolutely weren't made of cheap money, but of absolute legacy and pure honor. From her highly secure corner office at the massive foundation headquarters, she calmly, clinically observed Alexander's highly aggressive legal maneuvers with an incredibly chilling serenity that deeply unnerved her own elite legal team. Carter, her close friend and brilliant lawyer, was highly concerned by her apparent, highly dangerous passivity in the face of the massive aggressive lawsuits for marital annulment and severe moral damages that were violently arriving in the Daily Mail. "Victoria, we desperately need to aggressively countersue immediately. He is actively trying to legally claim massive moral damages against you," Carter insisted, nervously reviewing the heavy legal briefs. But Victoria's brilliant mind was entirely focused on a highly confidential, highly secretive medical appointment she had aggressively kept completely hidden from everyone. She had been secretly driving to a highly secure private medical clinic in a neighboring county, entirely to avoid massive local leaks. The older, highly discreet, elite doctor had explicitly, scientifically confirmed exactly what her body had been aggressively screaming at her for weeks, with sudden morning nausea and highly unexpected dizzy spells. Upon seeing the grainy black and white ultrasound image on the bright monitor, Victoria absolutely did not feel pathetic fear. She did not feel agonizing sadness. She felt a massive, rushing wave of pure, absolute, primal power. That tiny, beautiful being growing fiercely inside her womb was absolutely not a tragic mistake. It was the undeniable, living, physical proof of her absolute, unbreakable resistance. And it was the ultimate, lethal key to her total, massive victory. She aggressively decided she absolutely would not cowardly send a sterile legal letter. She would absolutely not send a pathetic email to deliver the massive news. The horrific scandal had been incredibly, brutally public, and her absolute, lethal response needed to be exactly the same. She aggressively convened a highly formal, massive press conference in the grand ballroom of the absolute oldest, most prestigious luxury hotel in the city. It was a highly neutral, incredibly elegant battleground. The official, highly exclusive invitation promised a massive, definitive, global declaration regarding the absolute future of the Caldwell family and the Phoenix Foundation. The greedy journalists, absolutely starving for significantly more explosive drama after the violent confrontation in the square, aggressively packed the massive ballroom completely full hours before the scheduled time. Alexander heard about the highly publicized conference on the local radio while he was aggressively shaving his face. A highly toxic, sarcastic laugh violently escaped his throat upon hearing the announcement. Now what the hell does this crazy bitch want? She's probably going to pathetically announce she's running for local mayor, he arrogantly thought, completely, utterly underestimating his highly lethal opponent. He aggressively decided absolutely not to attend in person, explicitly so he wouldn't grant her the pathetic satisfaction of seeing him. But he immediately turned on the massive flat-screen TV in the rental house to eagerly watch the highly anticipated live broadcast. He aggressively poured himself a massive glass of neat liquor, sat heavily on the expensive sofa, and eagerly waited to watch her publicly humiliate herself, trying to play a pathetic politician. At the exact scheduled time, Victoria confidently entered the massive ballroom. But this time, she absolutely wasn't wearing highly rigid, intimidating power suits, nor was she wearing dark, mourning colors. She was wearing an incredibly simple, flowing, cream-colored linen dress. It was highly comfortable and gave her an incredibly serene, almost angelic, glowing maternal aura that absolutely no one had ever seen her possess before. She sat calmly at the massive mahogany table, heavily surrounded by dozens of microphones. She gracefully folded her hands directly on top of the table and patiently waited for the chaotic murmur of the reporters and the blinding camera flashes to completely cease. Her beautiful gaze slowly, confidently, swept across the massive room. It was incredibly firm, but it entirely lacked the blinding, white-hot rage of the previous encounter. Now, there was a highly unsettling, absolute, terrifying peace in her eyes. Thank you absolutely all for coming today. I am highly aware that my private personal life has tragically, violently become a topic of massive public domain, she began, her voice incredibly soft, but heavily amplified by the microphones. For agonizing months, everyone has aggressively spoken about a massive wedding that violently ended before it even began, about horrific domestic violence, and about taking toxic sides. Today, I intend to put a permanent, absolute end to absolutely all of the wild speculation. She took a massive, highly dramatic pause, taking a slow, calm sip of ice water. While in the rental house, Alexander aggressively leaned forward toward the TV screen, suddenly physically feeling a highly strange, terrifying tightness aggressively gripping his chest. Alexander Caldwell has aggressively attempted to legally sue me, to violently steal my peace, and to maliciously smear my pristine name, actively claiming that our legal bond was permanently, completely severed on that horrific afternoon on the church steps. Victoria continued smoothly. But the absolute reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are certain highly profound bonds that absolutely cannot be severed by a simple, pathetic divorce signature, nor by a massive restraining order. The entire massive room went completely, utterly, dead silent. The greedy journalists completely stopped furiously typing on their laptops. They intuitively, profoundly knew that something incredibly massive, highly explosive, was coming. Victoria slowly, gracefully stood up, and with an incredibly deliberate, highly protective, gentle movement, she placed both of her hands directly over her slightly rounded belly, lovingly cradling it. The physical gesture was absolutely unmistakable. It was universally understood, and it was incredibly, terrifyingly powerful. A massive collective murmur of pure, unadulterated shock aggressively rippled through the massive ballroom exactly like a violent electrical current. "I'm officially expecting a child," she announced with absolute crystal clarity. The explosive news detonated violently in the heavy air, instantly, aggressively, completely changing the entire narrative of the massive story. "I am currently exactly 5 months pregnant. This innocent baby was physically right there with me on the stone steps of that church when I was brutally, violently assaulted. In the luxury rental house, Alexander's heavy crystal glass violently slipped from his hand, aggressively shattering into 1,000,000 pieces and spilling expensive liquor all over the expensive rug. He sat completely, utterly paralyzed. His mouth was literally hanging wide open. He was utterly incapable of mentally processing the massive fact that he was actually going to be a father, that his elite, billionaire lineage was actively continuing. A highly toxic, twisted mixture of arrogant macho pride and massive confusion violently flooded his brain. He immediately, arrogantly thought, "It is my son. He is a Caldwell. She absolutely cannot legally take him from me." He was already aggressively, psychotically, imagining exactly how he would ruthlessly use the child to miraculously recover his elite social standing and violently chain Victoria to him forever. But at the massive press conference, Victoria was absolutely not finished. Her beautiful face suddenly hardened into pure, unbreakable stone. Her voice took on the terrifying absolute tone of a final, unappealable, Supreme Court sentence. "I explicitly know exactly what you are all currently thinking. And I know exactly what he is arrogantly thinking right now, wherever the hell he is cowardly hiding," she stated, glaring directly, intensely into the main camera lens, exactly as if she were staring straight through the television screen, directly into Alexander's black soul. "But I want to make something incredibly, absolutely, legally clear, before the federal law and before this entire society." She paused. "This child will absolutely never, ever carry the last name of a violent abuser." The massive, explosive declaration instantly caused an absolute, chaotic uproar. The shocked journalists aggressively began shouting frantic questions. "Is that legally possible? Does Alexander already know? Are you legally going to deny him paternity?" Victoria calmly raised her hand, effortlessly demanding total order, without losing a single ounce of her terrifying composure. "I have officially, legally, initiated the massive federal procedures to register my child exclusively, entirely under my own last names, and in absolute, profound honor of the incredible woman who miraculously saved my life. The child will carry my grandmother's maiden name first. The elite Caldwell surname, in this specific branch of the family tree, permanently terminates right here." Victoria ruthlessly drove the absolute, final, lethal nail directly into the coffin of Alexander's massive, toxic ego. "I will absolutely not permit my innocent child to carry the toxic, horrific legacy of a monster who brutally hits women. My child will be aggressively raised with fierce values of absolute respect, completely, permanently far away from the highly toxic, violent shadow of his biological sperm donor. It was a massive, radical declaration of absolute, total independence. She wasn't just legally divorcing the man. She was violently, permanently divorcing his entire elite bloodline. Alexander, watching the live broadcast, physically felt the blinding fury aggressively burning his veins significantly hotter than the cheap alcohol he had just consumed. He violently screamed horrific, toxic insults at the television, aggressively kicking the heavy wooden coffee table and violently flipping it over. "That bastard kid is mine! She cannot illegally steal my damn name!" he roared, completely, utterly out of his mind. The terrifying idea that his own biological son would absolutely not carry his elite name was the ultimate, absolute, catastrophic humiliation for a man raised in the absolute most toxic, macho environment in the entire region. In the elegant hotel ballroom, Victoria calmly continued flawlessly explaining her massive decision, accurately citing complex federal laws and the fundamental rights of children to live entirely free from domestic violence. A true father is absolutely not simply a man who biologically conceives a child on a drunken night. A true father is a man who fiercely protects, deeply cares for, and unconditionally respects. Alexander completely, permanently lost that sacred right the absolute microsecond he violently raised his hand against the mother of his child, she firmly stated. Her powerful words resonated with massive force, instantly generating a massive national debate on social media and major news networks about toxic paternity and the legal rights of violent abusers. Carter, sitting proudly right next to her, confidently presented the massive stack of highly official medical and psychological evaluations that legally supported the massive decision to fiercely protect the minor from the father's highly toxic environment. The legal strategy was completely, utterly impeccable. It absolutely wasn't a petty, vindictive whim. It was a highly necessary, federally backed protective measure against a documented, highly unstable, violent monster. Victoria was brilliantly, aggressively weaponizing the exact same legal system that Alexander desperately wanted to use against her, successfully building a massive, impenetrable legal fortress completely around her unborn baby. This incredible pregnancy miraculously gave me the fierce strength to aggressively get out of bed on the exact days I desperately wanted to die, Victoria confessed, slightly lowering her impenetrable guard and beautifully showing her raw, vulnerable human side. And for this beautiful new life coming into the world, I will aggressively fight to the absolute bitter end. I will absolutely not be intimidated, not by massive lawsuits, and certainly not by pathetic, cowardly threats. She gently touched her massive belly once again. That incredibly powerful, striking image would become the absolute front cover of every single major national newspaper the very next morning. The fierce lioness aggressively defending her precious cub. The massive conference officially ended without Victoria accepting any highly intrusive questions about the baby's gender or the exact due date, fiercely keeping those intimate details completely private. She proudly walked out of the massive hall, heavily surrounded by her elite team, walking confidently amidst the loud, thunderous applause of the female reporters, who stared at her with pure, unadulterated admiration. She had successfully, brilliantly transformed a highly toxic, embarrassing gossip scandal into a massive, historic civil rights milestone. And the elite city of Beaufort would absolutely never look at wealthy last names the exact same way, ever again. Interactive question. She is changing the baby's last name. Do you think she went too far, or did Alexander deserve it? Let us know. The storm and the cabin siege. While Victoria exited highly victorious, Alexander was violently destroying the expensive rental room, aggressively smashing expensive lamps, and violently punching the thick drywall until his knuckles were completely bloody and bruised. He frantically called his exhausted lawyer, screaming at the top of his lungs, aggressively demanding that he immediately file massive injunctions to violently stop this insanity and instantly claim full parental rights. I want that damn child. He is my absolute only chance to clear my name, he violently vociferated, completely, terrifyingly failing to understand that his massive obsession was absolutely not love. It was pure, highly toxic possession. Night heavily fell over the city, with a terrifying, renewed tension. There was now a completely innocent life, placed squarely in the middle of a brutal, violent battlefield. People whispered loudly at family dinners about Victoria's incredible audacity. Some highly traditional conservatives were deeply scandalized by the aggressive break from elite tradition, while others wildly celebrated her terrifying courage. But absolutely everyone completely agreed on one massive, undeniable fact. Alexander was absolutely not going to just sit quietly. She had violently, deeply wounded his massive ego to the absolute core. And a wounded, cornered animal is the absolute most dangerous, lethal creature of all. Victoria returned safely to her grandmother's highly secure cabin, deeply exhausted, but incredibly happy. Physically feeling the strong, beautiful kicks of her baby, exactly as if they were a massive confirmation that she had done the absolute right thing. Grandma Beatrice was warmly waiting for her, with a hot cup of herbal tea and a massive, proud smile, profoundly knowing that her own maiden name, the fierce name of the unbreakable mountain women, would proudly, permanently endure. They sat peacefully on the massive wooden porch to look at the bright stars, completely oblivious for a brief moment to the terrifying, massive storm that was rapidly approaching. Because Alexander, completely consumed by his toxic loneliness and blinding madness, was already actively, aggressively plotting his absolute next move. One that absolutely did not involve elite lawyers or federal judges. If the strict federal law wouldn't hand him his child, he would violently take it his own terrifying way. He glared aggressively out the rental window at the dark, imposing silhouette of the massive mountain range where they lived, and he violently swore to himself that the child would absolutely carry his elite name, even if he had to aggressively write it in fire over the burning ashes of the entire damn city. The highly tense months immediately following the explosive pregnancy announcement passed in a terrifying, suffocating waiting game that kept the entire city of Beaufort completely on edge, constantly, nervously glancing toward the mountain road. Victoria Kensington had miraculously transformed into an almost sacred, untouchable figure for the fierce women of the region. They aggressively, voluntarily organized highly structured, 24/7 spontaneous neighborhood watch patrols completely surrounding her grandmother's remote cabin. They absolutely refused to allow a single, unknown vehicle to drive up the dirt road without being aggressively interrogated, effectively creating a massive, impenetrable fortress of pure female solidarity. The loyal neighbors constantly brought her massive baskets of fresh fruit, highly effective home remedies for her painful swelling, and beautifully hand-knitted clothes for the baby, actively weaving an unbreakable net of pure love that flawlessly shielded the fierce mother-to-be. Alexander, meanwhile, had completely deteriorated into a pathetic, terrifying specter that aimlessly haunted the absolute worst, most disgusting dive bars in the neighboring counties. aggressively spending the tiny bit of cash he had left on highly toxic vices. His physical appearance was utterly pathetic. He had lost a massive amount of weight, and his bloodshot eyes possessed a highly manic, psychotic gleam that instantly terrified absolutely anyone who even attempted to approach him. He agonizingly spent hours aggressively drawing highly absurd, psychotic plans on cheap paper napkins, frantically tracing secret, hidden routes to successfully reach the mountain cabin, completely undetected by the crazy witches, as he toxically called Victoria's fierce protectors. His blinding obsession with forcing his elite last name onto the child had completely, violently devoured any microscopic trace of basic rationality he had left, fully converting him into a massive, ticking time bomb. The local police force, heavily pressured by the highly influential Phoenix Foundation and the massive, constant national media attention, permanently stationed a marked patrol car directly at the main entrance of the rural mountain road. However, Victoria profoundly, instinctively knew that local authorities would absolutely never be enough to violently stop a psychotic man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. She slept terribly, with exactly one eye open, constantly, lovingly caressing her massive belly, softly whispering to her unborn son, fiercely promising him that absolutely no one would ever, ever hurt him. The beautiful, deep connection with her baby had magically become her infinite, massive source of pure energy, successfully transforming blinding fear into a fierce, highly primal, lethal instinct for absolute defense. The 8th agonizing month of her pregnancy finally arrived, and with it, the absolute most violent, catastrophic rainy season the region had witnessed in decades, violently transforming the dirt mountain roads into highly dangerous, impassable rivers of thick, freezing mud. The heavy sky remained a depressing, dark, lead gray during the day, and completely, terrifyingly pitch black at night, massively increasing the suffocating feeling of total isolation at the grandmother's remote cabin. Grandma Beatrice, highly superstitious exactly like all older women from the deep mountains, constantly lit bright candles to the saints and aggressively burned strong incense in the dark corners, explicitly claiming that the heavy atmosphere felt incredibly dense, completely loaded with highly malicious, evil intentions. The absolute devil is currently roaming completely loose, my beautiful girl, and he is desperately, actively searching for exactly where to violently break in, she murmured darkly, aggressively locking the heavy wooden deadbolts on all the doors. On a terrifying, freezing Friday night, the massive storm violently unleashed its absolute biblical fury. The deafening, explosive thunder violently shook the very stone foundations of the cabin, and the freezing wind aggressively howled exactly like a massive, wounded beast through the towering pine trees. It was exactly in this highly chaotic, terrifying scenario that Victoria physically felt the absolute first, undeniable, massive contraction. A sharp, blindingly agonizing pain that violently ripped through her lower back, brutally forcing her to double over in pure agony. It was absolutely not a false alarm. The baby had aggressively decided to arrive at the absolute most complicated, terrifying moment possible, violently defying the chaotic elements. Grandma Beatrice, flawlessly maintaining the absolute, terrifying calm of a fierce woman who had personally assisted in dozens of rural births, immediately began boiling massive pots of water and preparing clean, warm sheets. She profoundly knew they absolutely could not safely make it down the treacherous mountain to the luxury hospital in this catastrophic weather. Meanwhile, far down below in the flooded valley, Alexander violently saw the massive, chaotic storm as the absolute perfect, miraculous opportunity he had been desperately waiting for during agonizing weeks of psychotic surveillance. He profoundly knew that the pathetic police patrol would have cowardly taken shelter from the freezing rain, and that the deafening, explosive noise of the massive downpour would completely, flawlessly cover the loud sound of his engine and his heavy footsteps. He aggressively, violently stole a highly battered, heavy-duty pickup truck from a nearby, abandoned farm and desperately began the incredibly dangerous ascent up the flooded, muddy mountain road. The cheap windshield wipers fought an absolute, pathetic, losing battle against the massive, violent torrents of freezing water. He was aggressively armed, absolutely not with a firearm, but with the highly psychotic, delirious certainty that tonight he would violently, permanently recover exactly what was his by absolute, divine right. Alexander's stolen truck violently skidded and slid in the thick mud, aggressively smashing into heavy rocks and thick tree branches. But he violently slammed his foot directly down on the accelerator, laughing hysterically, with a highly terrifying, psychotic mixture of pure euphoria and blinding desperation. When he finally violently crashed the truck near the property line, it became hopelessly stuck in the deep mud. He aggressively abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot, instantly getting completely soaked to the bone, the freezing, icy rain aggressively whipping against his face. He violently scaled the heavy stone perimeter wall at the back of the property, aggressively slicing his hands open on the sharp, jagged edges. But he physically felt absolutely zero pain due to the massive, blinding surge of adrenaline. He moved exactly like a feral, starving predator in the pitch-black darkness, guided entirely by the single, warm light actively glowing in Victoria's bedroom window. Inside the remote cabin, Victoria's brutal contractions were rapidly becoming incredibly frequent and overwhelmingly, blindingly painful, aggressively forcing her to pace frantically back and forth across the wooden floor, heavily supported by her strong grandmother. "Just breathe, my beautiful daughter. Breathe incredibly deep. Your beautiful son desperately wants to finally meet you," Grandma Beatrice encouraged her, gently wiping the thick sweat from her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. Suddenly, the massive guard dogs outside aggressively began barking frantically, viciously directing their fury toward the absolute back of the dark patio. "That is an aggressive attack bark. Absolutely not a warning," the grandmother stated, completely stopping dead in her tracks. She abruptly, violently turned off the bedroom light and aggressively stared out the dark window with highly narrowed eyes, profoundly knowing that this specific late-night visit was absolutely not friendly. "It is him, Grandma. I can physically, terrifyingly feel it in my chest. It's absolutely him," Victoria whispered through agonizing gasps of pure pain, aggressively gripping the older woman's arm with bone-crushing force. Grandma Beatrice absolutely did not waste a single microscopic second. She aggressively marched directly to the heavy wooden closet and violently pulled out a massive, antique, double-barreled hunting shotgun that had once proudly belonged to her late husband. It was completely unloaded, but it was incredibly, terrifyingly imposing. "You focus entirely on giving birth to that beautiful boy. I, and the fierce women of this mountain, will aggressively take care of that pathetic, disgusting bastard," the older woman sentenced, with a voice made of pure, unbreakable steel. She immediately grabbed her two-way radio and aggressively called the absolute closest neighbors, actively utilizing the highly specific urgent emergency code they had meticulously established months ago. Alexander violently reached the heavy back door and immediately began aggressively throwing his massive shoulder against it, violently roaring Victoria's name with a terrifying, psychotic voice that seamlessly mixed with the explosive thunder. "Open the damn door, Victoria! I absolutely know you are in there! I came to violently take my son!" he roared, completely, utterly hallucinating. The ancient thick wood violently groaned under the massive impacts. Every single aggressive blow echoed terrifyingly in Victoria's heart, exactly like a direct, lethal threat to the beautiful life that was desperately trying to be born. She aggressively took refuge in the absolute furthest, darkest corner of the room, fiercely protecting her massive belly with heavy pillows, panting heavily to desperately control the blinding panic and the excruciating pain of the active labor. But Alexander completely, utterly failed to calculate the massive, highly invisible security net that fiercely surrounded that specific cabin. Before he could violently kick the heavy door completely off its hinges, dozens of bright flashlight beams suddenly, violently pierced through the freezing rain. They absolutely were not the pathetic local police. They were the fierce, unbreakable women of the village, the loyal neighbors, the hardened peasant women who had aggressively hiked up the treacherous flooded mountain shortcuts and hidden paths. The absolute microsecond they heard the urgent radio alert, they aggressively arrived heavily armed with thick wooden clubs, sharp farming pitchforks, and massive heavy rocks. They instantly, violently, surrounded the terrified intruder directly in the freezing, torrential downpour. They absolutely possessed zero fear. They were heavily fueled by the massive, accumulated rage of agonizing years of passively watching toxic, abusive men exactly like him violently hurt their sisters and their daughters. "Get the hell out of here, you pathetic coward!" one of the fierce women violently screamed, aggressively slamming a heavy metal shovel against the stone patio to make a deafening noise and establish a highly lethal distance. Alexander violently spun around, completely surprised, suddenly horrifyingly realizing he was entirely surrounded by over a dozen dark, female silhouettes who were glaring at him with absolute murderous determination. "Get out of my damn way, you crazy old hags! This has absolutely nothing to do with you!" he violently screamed at them, desperately trying to intimidate them by aggressively taking a step forward. But absolutely not a single woman took a step backward. On the contrary, they aggressively closed the massive circle, violently cornering him directly against the cold wall of the cabin under the freezing, incessant rain. Grandma Beatrice violently threw the heavy back door wide open, aggressively pointing the massive, unloaded shotgun directly at his chest. She glared at him with a terrifying, lethal look that completely froze Alexander's blood significantly faster than the freezing rain. "You take exactly one more damn step, and I swear to the Holy Virgin, you will absolutely not leave this mountain alive," the grandmother sentenced, with an absolute, terrifying authority that left zero room for any doubt. Alexander completely froze. He stared terrified at the massive double barrel of the gun, and then at the fierce, armed women completely surrounding him. He profoundly, horrifyingly realized that he had completely, utterly lost the massive advantage. For the absolute first time in his arrogant, toxic life, the elite, alpha male felt incredibly small, completely overpowered by the massive, collective physical force of the exact people he had arrogantly considered weak and pathetic. In that exact moment of absolute maximum tension, a highly piercing, lacerating scream violently echoed from the deep interior of the cabin. It was Victoria, agonizingly announcing that the absolute final moment had finally arrived. That massive, beautiful scream, completely filled with pure life and absolute agony, acted exactly like a highly explosive catalyst for the fierce women outside. They aggressively took one more massive unified step directly toward Alexander. "Did you hear that?" She is actively giving birth. You will absolutely not tarnish this beautiful, sacred moment with your disgusting, filthy presence. Get out!" The fierce leader of the group violently spat. Alexander, completely defeated, utterly humiliated, and profoundly terrified, clearly understood that if he aggressively attempted a single, violent move, they would absolutely, violently lynch him right there in the mud, without a single microsecond of hesitation. With his head pathetically lowered, and his massive and arrogant pride completely shattered into a million pieces, Alexander slowly, cowardly backed away into the freezing darkness of the woods, violently cursing under his breath, but frantically fleeing exactly like the pathetic, terrified coward he truly was. The fierce women absolutely did not chase him. They simply remained standing perfectly still, aggressively guarding the property in the freezing rain, flawlessly forming a highly protective, human barrier until they were absolutely, 100% certain he was permanently gone. Their massive victory wasn't violent. It was absolute, pure moral dominance. They had successfully, flawlessly protected the sacred sanctuary of brand new life entirely with their sheer, imposing presence. Inside the warm cabin, Victoria was violently pushing with the absolute last remaining drops of massive energy she possessed, now incredibly supported not only by her fierce grandmother, but by the massive, powerful energy of absolutely all the brave women standing guard outside. "Exactly one more massive push, my beautiful girl. Just one more. It's almost over," Grandma Beatrice aggressively encouraged her, and with one absolute, final, superhuman effort, heavily accompanied by a massive, liberating scream, the beautiful baby finally, miraculously, arrived into the world. There was absolutely no need for a doctor's slap. The incredibly healthy infant let out a massive, powerful, crystal-clear cry all on its own, aggressively, triumphantly, announcing its incredible arrival right in the absolute dead center of the massive, chaotic storm. Grandma Beatrice lovingly wrapped the screaming newborn in a perfectly clean, warm blanket and gently placed him directly onto Victoria's exhausted chest. She was simultaneously violently crying and hysterically laughing. "He is a beautiful, incredibly strong, perfectly healthy baby boy, Victoria," the grandmother said, gently wiping the tiny baby's perfect face with infinite, absolute tenderness. Victoria stared deeply at her beautiful son. She looked directly into those tiny, curious eyes that were actively searching for her, and she profoundly, undeniably, knew that she had absolutely, totally won the massive war. That beautiful, innocent boy possessed absolutely nothing of his father's toxic evil. He was pure, unadulterated light. He was pure, infinite future. And he was completely, 100%, undeniably hers. The violent storm outside aggressively began to slowly diminish, exactly as if nature itself profoundly recognized that the terrifying danger had permanently passed, and that absolute, beautiful balance had been fully restored. The fierce women standing guard outside clearly heard the beautiful, loud cry of the newborn baby, and they instantly erupted into massive, joyful applause and loud cheers under the light, freezing drizzle that remained. They fiercely hugged each other, joyfully celebrating not only the beautiful birth, but the massive, undeniable fact that they had successfully, flawlessly, stopped a terrifying monster without spilling a single drop of vital blood. Alexander, pathetically wandering completely lost through the freezing, muddy brush, clearly heard the loud applause echoing in the distance. He physically felt a massive, terrifying, bottomless void violently open up in his stomach. He violently slipped on a steep, muddy ravine and violently tumbled all the way down until he lay completely broken and pathetic in a freezing, filthy ditch. Covered in mud, utterly alone, and completely defeated by his own massive, toxic obsession. He remained pathetically stuck there until the absolute break of dawn, violently shivering from the freezing cold. While high above him, in the incredibly warm, safe cabin, a completely brand new, powerful dynasty was officially beginning. The local police finally found him the very next morning. He was highly hypothermic and completely delirious. They violently arrested him on the spot, and this time, there was absolutely zero bail allowed. He was heavily charged with massive violation of a federal restraining order, illegal breaking and entering, and attempted assault. Interactive question. The local women protected her. Who is the strongest, most protective woman you know? Tag or mention her in the comments. The new dawn and the ultimate victory. The very next morning, the bright sun rose incredibly brilliantly and perfectly clear over Beaufort, beautifully illuminating the massive puddles that the violent nocturnal storm had left behind. The explosive news of the beautiful birth and Alexander's pathetic, failed, criminal attempt aggressively raced through the entire city. But this time, there was absolutely zero malicious, toxic gossip. There was only pure, unadulterated admiration. The locals proudly claimed that the beautiful boy had been miraculously born, heavily blessed, completely under the fierce, unbreakable protection of absolutely all the brave mothers in the city. Victoria, resting incredibly peacefully in her warm bed with her beautiful son, safely in her arms, graciously received the fierce women who had bravely defended her, allowing them to finally meet the miracle baby. This beautiful boy is absolutely a son to every single one of you too, she told them with massive, profound gratitude, happily allowing them to gently hold him one by one. She had fiercely decided to officially name him Gabriel, exactly like the powerful messenger angel, because he beautifully, miraculously brought the incredible, highly anticipated good news that the blinding fear had permanently, completely ended in that house forever. Carter arrived promptly at noon, carrying the highly official civil registry documents fully prepared to be signed, and bringing even significantly better, massive news. Alexander is officially being permanently transferred to a massive, maximum security state penitentiary, Victoria. He absolutely cannot ever hurt you guys again, Carter assured her, looking down at the beautiful baby with pure tenderness. Victoria aggressively signed the highly official birth certificate with a perfectly firm, unshaking hand. She proudly, legally enshrined the powerful surnames of her maternal lineage, completely, federally erasing any microscopic, legal trace of the violent abuser from Gabriel's entire life. That beautiful day, the mountain cabin was completely filled with flowers. Absolutely not depressing funeral wreaths, and certainly not dry, pathetic bridal bouquets, but vibrant, incredibly alive, beautiful wildflowers that the loving neighbors continuously brought. The sweet, incredible scent of brand new life permanently replaced the suffocating, toxic stench of blinding fear that had heavily permeated those wooden walls for so many agonizing months. Victoria slowly stood up, walked confidently to the large window with her beautiful son, and stared proudly down at the massive city below, which was brilliantly shining under the bright sun. She profoundly knew that there was still exactly one absolute final act required to perfectly complete the massive circle. A highly public, symbolic action that would permanently heal not only her own massive wound, but the deep, bleeding wound of the entire community. But for now, in the highly intimate safety of her warm room, she deeply, profoundly enjoyed the absolute sweetest, most satisfying victory, being highly capable of holding her son completely free. knowing with absolute certainty that the pathetic villain was rotting behind thick iron bars, and that she was, finally, the absolute, undeniable master of her own massive destiny. The triumph and the plaza of the brave. Exactly 2 entire years had violently passed since that catastrophic, failed wedding that had aggressively shaken the very foundations of Beaufort and its surrounding areas. The bright morning sun beautifully illuminated the ancient stone of the main parish church with a golden, pristine light, incredibly different from the heavy, suffocating, toxic heat of that highly fateful day. The cobblestone streets perfectly surrounding the historic center were completely, securely closed to all vehicular traffic. But this time, it was absolutely not for a highly exclusive, private party for the toxic elite. It was for a massive, highly anticipated popular celebration. Beautiful violet and white flags proudly adorned the vintage street lamps and the wooden balconies of the colonial houses, gently, peacefully waving in the crisp, fresh mountain wind. From incredibly early in the morning, thousands of people aggressively began congregating in the massive square and the surrounding gardens. They arrived from absolutely all the neighboring communities, possessing an incredibly festive, yet highly solemn attitude. There were absolutely no toxic murmurs of malicious gossip, no highly judgmental, pathetic stares. The entire air was completely filled with a massive, profound sense of collective respect and incredibly shared pride for exactly what they had successfully, fiercely achieved together. The powerful women, many of them beautifully dressed in the highly traditional, embroidered blouses of the local region, proudly carried fresh, vibrant flowers in their hands to gently deposit them directly at the base of the central gazebo. The men who had previously viewed Victoria's massive movement with deep, toxic suspicion now proudly attended alongside their beautiful families, finally profoundly understanding that absolute, pure respect for women was the fundamental, non-negotiable base of any truly dignified community. Alexander had permanently mutated into a highly pathetic, distant bad memory, a dark, toxic shadow that was rapidly, aggressively fading completely from the collective memory of the local society. It was widely, publicly known that he was currently serving a massive, incredibly long sentence in a brutal, maximum security state prison, completely alone, absolutely without any visitors, miserably paying for his horrific past and present crimes. His highly arrogant, elite family had aggressively sold the massive mansion at a heavy loss and cowardly fled the state forever, completely incapable of bearing the massive, crushing weight of the absolute social condemnation that had violently fallen upon their pristine surname. The elite name of the Caldwells, which had previously easily opened absolutely all doors, was now universally, entirely synonymous with pure, unadulterated shame and a highly toxic, macho past that absolutely no one ever wanted to repeat. In Grandma Beatrice's beautiful cabin, the atmosphere was incredibly peaceful and deeply joyful. While Victoria meticulously prepared herself in front of the massive, full-length mirror, she deliberately, highly strategically chose to dress entirely in pristine white once again. It was a massive, highly symbolic act, specifically designed to completely cleanse and permanently reclaim the profound meaning of that beautiful color in her entire life. It was absolutely not a pathetic, restrictive wedding dress. It was an incredibly elegant, highly tailored, modern linen power suit, featuring wide-leg trousers and a flawless silk blouse, aggressively projecting a massive, untouchable image of pure power and absolute freedom. She looked deeply into her own eyes. She absolutely no longer saw the terrified, pathetic little girl desperately begging for toxic love. She saw a completely whole, terrifyingly powerful woman who had flawlessly, meticulously reconstructed her shattered soul piece by broken piece. Little Gabriel, who was already happily walking with slightly clumsy, adorable steps and laughing incredibly loudly, was happily playing on the soft rug with a beautifully hand-carved wooden car, completely oblivious to the massive, historical importance of the day. He was dressed in a tiny, perfect button-down shirt and soft cotton pants, looking exactly like the beautiful crown prince of a completely brand new, powerful dynasty based entirely on pure, unconditional love. Victoria lifted him fiercely into her arms, deeply inhaling the incredibly sweet, comforting scent of baby powder, profoundly feeling that this beautiful boy was her absolute, greatest, most massive victory against the terrifying darkness. Today, we are aggressively going to change history, my beautiful love, so that you can perfectly grow up in an infinitely better world, she whispered softly into his tiny ear right before stepping out the door. The massive drive down into the city was an absolute, triumphant procession. Incredible crowds of people happily came out of their houses just to proudly wave at her passing truck, joyfully throwing beautiful rose petals directly onto the path. Upon finally arriving at the massive square, the crowd naturally, beautifully, fell completely silent. A heavy silence incredibly full of massive expectation and pure, unadulterated admiration for the terrifyingly powerful figure confidently stepping out of the vehicle. Victoria walked directly into the absolute center of the massive square, with her head held incredibly high. She fiercely held her powerful grandmother's hand with one arm and proudly carried her beautiful son with the other. Carter, her fiercely loyal friend, and now massive, elite corporate partner in the Phoenix Foundation, walked proudly just one step behind her, smiling massively with the deep, profound satisfaction of a monumental job flawlessly accomplished. The brand new mayor of the municipality, a highly progressive young man who had successfully won the massive elections explicitly by fiercely promising to aggressively support the powerful women's cause, was respectfully waiting at the very base of the central statue. They had aggressively, highly symbolically, decided to violently remove the old, pathetic bust of a highly toxic, ancient general, explicitly to permanently replace it with something that significantly better represented the brand new, unbreakable values of the powerful community. A massive, heavy velvet cloth completely covered the brand new, towering monument, safely guarding the massive secret that was about to be explosively revealed right in front of everyone's eyes. Massive national television cameras were actively present, proudly broadcasting the highly historic event live, flawlessly closing the horrific cycle of violence with an absolute perfect golden key. Victoria confidently climbed up onto the highly decorated, improvised stage, gently leaving Gabriel safely in the highly capable, loving care of Grandma Beatrice. She aggressively grabbed the microphone with a massive, terrifying confidence that instantly, violently electrified the entire massive audience. Exactly 2 agonizing years ago, in this exact, precise location, I violently fell to my knees, brutally assaulted by the exact man who had formerly sworn to fiercely love me, she began, aggressively pointing directly at the exact, specific spot on the church steps. Her voice absolutely did not tremble for a single microsecond. It resonated incredibly loud and flawlessly clear through the massive, high-tech speakers, violently echoing off the ancient stone walls of the church, which had previously been silent, pathetic witnesses to her ultimate humiliation. On that horrific day, I genuinely, truly thought my entire life was completely, permanently over. I thought the massive, crushing shame would literally kill me, but I was incredibly, profoundly wrong. The brutal blow that violently knocked me into the dirt absolutely did not destroy me. It merely aggressively woke me up, and with my massive awakening, absolutely all of you violently woke up too, she continued, staring intensely, fiercely at the thousands of powerful women in the massive audience. We profoundly, collectively realized that absolute pathetic silence is the abuser's absolute best friend, and that our collective unbreakable voice is our absolute most terrifyingly powerful lethal weapon. There was a massive, spontaneous, deafening eruption of applause. Several women aggressively wiped away hot tears, deeply remembering their own horrific private battles, and exactly how Victoria's massive, public example had miraculously given them the terrifying courage to fiercely move forward. She patiently waited for the massive noise to completely cease before aggressively continuing with the absolute most critical, highly important part of her explosive speech. Today, this exact place, permanently, officially, ceases to be the horrific stage of my massive humiliation. Today, it violently transforms into the absolute, sacred altar of our collective, unbreakable dignity, she proclaimed with blinding, pure power. We will absolutely no longer remember this massive square for the pathetic, weak man who violently raised his hand. We will permanently, fiercely remember it for the powerful, untouchable women who aggressively raised their faces. She made a highly subtle, sharp gesture to the young mayor and to two fierce, beautiful survivors of domestic violence who were proudly accompanying her, aggressively signaling them to approach the massive, covered monument. The highly emotional, electric tension in the air was completely palpable. Absolutely everyone profoundly knew they were actively witnessing a massive, historic moment. On the count of 3, they aggressively pulled the thick golden rope. The heavy velvet cloth slid smoothly and beautifully to the ground, aggressively revealing a massive, brilliantly shining bronze plaque. In incredibly large, deeply engraved letters, it proudly, undeniably read, "Valiant Women's Square," and directly underneath, a highly powerful, unbreakable inscription that fiercely stated, "Here, absolutely no one ever surrenders. Here, we fiercely protect us all." The entire city violently exploded into massive, deafening cheers, loud screams of pure joy, and thunderous applause that literally made the solid ground violently vibrate, aggressively celebrating the brand new, highly empowering identity of their most important public space. But the massive, breathtaking surprise absolutely did not end there. Right next to the heavy bronze plaque, a massive, highly modern, breathtaking sculpture had been beautifully revealed. It perfectly, flawlessly depicted an incredibly strong woman, fiercely, lovingly helping another woman aggressively rise up from the ground. It absolutely did not possess Victoria's specific face. It was a highly generic, incredibly beautiful face that perfectly represented absolutely any woman. Every single woman who fiercely fights every single day of her life. It was a massive, permanent symbol of eternal, unbreakable sisterhood, flawlessly cast in solid metal. A highly physical, undeniable promise that absolutely no woman would ever be completely alone in Beaufort again. Victoria stepped forward and touched the massive sculpture with deep, profound reverence. She physically felt the cold, hard metal under her warm fingers, permanently, officially sealing the unbreakable pact with her massive community. At that exact, precise, beautiful microsecond, the massive church bells aggressively began to ring incredibly loudly, exactly as they had done on that horrific wedding day. The loud metallic sound violently flooded the massive square. But this time, it absolutely did not announce a highly toxic marriage permanently condemned to massive failure, nor an incredibly fake, pathetic union. The beautiful ringing sounded exactly like pure, unadulterated freedom, like massive, undeniable victory. It was a beautiful, deafening celebration of a powerful life that fiercely continued to thrive despite the massive, agonizing wounds of the dead past. Victoria closed her eyes for one beautiful moment, completely allowing the deafening sound to aggressively cleanse the absolute last, tiny remaining traces of toxic pain that might have still lingered in her auditory memory. The brand new priest of the parish, a highly progressive, incredibly kind young man who had officially replaced the cowardly, elderly priest, confidently stepped out onto the steps to beautifully, formally bless the massive square and the new sculpture with holy water. May this beautiful place absolutely always be a safe, impenetrable refuge, and absolutely never again a terrifying tribunal of toxic judgment, the priest stated powerfully, officially acknowledging the massive, pathetic failures of the church in the past. It was an incredibly profound, massive moment of spiritual reconciliation for Victoria. She had genuinely, agonizingly felt that God had completely abandoned her on that altar that day. Now, she profoundly, beautifully understood that her deep faith had simply, miraculously, transformed into aggressive action, and that God was undeniably present in the fierce, unbreakable strength of the incredibly brave women who had miraculously saved her. Little Gabriel, slightly startled by the incredibly loud noise of the massive bells, ran quickly toward his mother's legs, desperately seeking absolute protection and deep comfort in the middle of the massive uproar. Victoria smiled radiantly and aggressively scooped him up into her arms again. She proudly held him high, showing him to the massive crowd exactly like the absolute most valuable, priceless trophy of her entire brutal war. The absolute perfect future that they had all successfully, fiercely managed to protect. The massive crowd began to loudly, joyfully chant the little boy's name in a beautiful, deafening chorus, actively blessing him, completely recognizing him as one of their very own, entirely, permanently free from the highly toxic, disgusting stain of his biological father. It was the absolute, final, undeniable confirmation that the horrific, toxic lineage of violence had been completely, violently severed at the root, making massive, beautiful room for a highly healthy, perfect new generation. Carter smoothly approached Victoria and gently, highly respectfully, handed her a massive, stunning bouquet of pristine white roses. It was completely, flawlessly identical to the exact bouquet she had violently burned in her grandmother's fireplace. But these roses were incredibly alive, highly vibrant, and perfectly fresh. For the absolutely beautiful brand new bride, the fierce woman who successfully, flawlessly married her own absolute freedom, he told her, with a massive smile completely filled with pure affection and incredibly deep, profound respect. Victoria graciously accepted the beautiful flowers, deeply inhaling their incredibly sweet, fresh fragrance, and she smiled brightly for the absolute first time with a completely, utterly perfect happiness, entirely without any dark, toxic shadows. She absolutely no longer needed to violently burn them. Now, she could beautifully, fully enjoy them, because they absolutely no longer represented a heavy, toxic chain, but an incredibly beautiful, priceless gift from life. The massive national press immediately rushed forward for the highly anticipated, official photographs, aggressively capturing the exact, iconic image that would dominate the front cover of every single major magazine and elite newspaper the very next morning across the entire country. Victoria Kensington, dressed flawlessly in pristine white, fiercely holding her beautiful son in her arms, heavily surrounded by hundreds of powerful women, standing proudly directly under the massive bronze sign that read, "Valiant Women's Square." That highly iconic, incredibly powerful photograph would permanently, violently replace the blurry, pathetic, toxic video of the violent slap in every single internet search engine forever. They had successfully, brilliantly rewritten the entire visual narrative of her massive life, aggressively imposing the beautiful image of absolute triumph over the pathetic image of victimization. As the late afternoon slowly faded, the massive square beautifully transformed into a highly festive, popular celebration. There was loud, incredible country music, highly delicious, traditional food, and beautiful folkloric dances that completely filled the atmosphere with vibrant, massive color. Victoria danced joyfully with her proud father, who wept openly with pure, unadulterated emotion upon seeing his beautiful daughter so incredibly strong, so utterly, perfectly happy after enduring so much agonizing suffering. Grandma Beatrice quietly observed absolutely everything from a comfortable wooden bench, nodding slowly with deep satisfaction, profoundly knowing that her massive, critical job in this earth was flawlessly, perfectly done. The fierce matriarch had successfully passed the heavy, unbreakable torch of pure strength directly to her granddaughter, permanently ensuring the fierce survival of her unbreakable spirit. A small, adorable group of young, tiny girls timidly approached Victoria, staring up at her with massive, bright, shining eyes, looking exactly as if they were staring at a real-life, flesh-and-blood superhero. "Are you the brave bride who absolutely refused to surrender?" one of the little girls asked with pure, sweet innocence, utilizing the massive nickname the national press had fiercely given her. Victoria smiled warmly. She gracefully crouched down to be exactly at their eye level, gently, tenderly caressed the little girl's cheek, and responded with the absolute, most profound truth. "I am just Victoria, and you, my beautiful girl, can also be an absolutely terrifyingly valiant woman when you grow up. Do absolutely never, ever let anyone in this world tell you otherwise." The dark night finally arrived, beautifully covering the city with a breathtaking, massive blanket of bright stars. The colorful lights in the massive square shone infinitely brighter than ever before, reflecting perfectly on the highly polished bronze plaque. Victoria decided to peacefully retire early to put little Gabriel safely to sleep. She walked slowly back to her car, with her heart incredibly full and her soul infinitely light. Looking back for one absolute final time, she beautifully saw happy couples peacefully strolling hand in hand through the massive square, treating each other with pure, genuine affection and absolute respect. She profoundly knew that the massive cultural shift would take agonizing years to fully complete, but the powerful seed was permanently planted, and it possessed incredibly deep, unbreakable roots. As the luxury SUV smoothly drove away toward the towering mountains, Victoria thought about Alexander for one brief, microscopic second. Absolutely not with toxic hatred, but with a highly absolute, profound, freezing indifference. He was the dead past, a pathetic, defeated ghost that absolutely no longer possessed even a microscopic ounce of power to terrify her, nor to ever define exactly who she fiercely was in the present. Her massive ultimate revenge hadn't been to violently, aggressively destroy him. It had been to violently, aggressively build herself up, so incredibly massive and so terrifyingly strong that he had naturally, pathetically, become completely, utterly insignificant. She had succeeded brilliantly, with flying, explosive colors. Her absolute, massive happiness was the ultimate, most devastating punishment for the exact monster who had maliciously, desperately wanted to see her ruined. The powerful name of Victoria Kensington permanently converted into a massive, untouchable legend. It was fiercely told in busy kitchens and schoolyards as a highly modern, beautiful fable of absolute, unbreakable resistance. The bride who refused to surrender completely stopped being a sensationalist headline to become an integral, permanent part of the modern folklore of the entire nation. And just like that, in a small, traditional city of cobblestone streets and flower-filled balconies, one incredibly fierce woman flawlessly demonstrated that sometimes the absolute perfect ending of a fairy tale is absolutely not a massive, luxury wedding. It is the exact, explosive moment when the powerful princess violently, fiercely saves her own damn self. Beaufort slept incredibly peacefully that night, beautifully lulled by the freezing, fresh wind from the mountains, profoundly knowing that tomorrow would be a completely brand new day. An infinitely more just, highly respectful day for absolutely everyone. And in the warm, safe bedroom of an ancient, remote cabin, a highly powerful woman and her beautiful son slept incredibly tranquilly, deeply dreaming of a massive, untouchable future that was, finally, completely, 100% theirs. The agonizing pain had permanently vanished, and the absolute only thing remaining was immense, brilliant, and incredibly sweet, absolute freedom.